All right. Hello, everybody. Today I am with Dr. Lydia McGrew. Dr. Lydia McGrew is the author of a book, a relatively new book, The Mirror and the Mask. And you also have another book. Oh, I'm forgetting its name at the moment.
The Eye of the Beholder.
The Eye of the Beholder. And would you like to maybe just introduce yourself, a little bit more about yourself so our audience understands?
Sure. So my name is Lydia McGrew, and I am a analytic philosopher, fairly widely published analytic philosopher. My PhD is in English. Right now, for one more year, I am a homeschooling mother. I'm in my last year of homeschooling, so last school year of homeschooling. And I am a writer of New Testament research now. In the last few years, I've begun doing that as well, while continuing to work in philosophy as well. I'm also the wife of philosopher and apologist Dr. Timothy McGrew, and I'm the homemaker. I keep this place together and running around here at the homestead, at the McGrew homestead. So that's basically who I am, and I'm always working on something. It might
Yeah.
be an article, it might be a video. I've recently started a little YouTube channel where I put some of my YouTube videos, and I'll be trying to have some more of that content as well. So I'm always trying to do something new.
Great. Well, it's a good year for a last year for homeschooling.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
I think that a lot of people are homeschooling sort of by lack of choice, I guess, today. So,
Well, I've been
um,
doing it for 20 years or more.
wow,
So I've been
that's
doing it all
fantastic.
along.
That's great. So you're well practiced as opposed to a lot of the newcomers, although I'm sure there's probably a lot of people asking for your help and questions and support and stuff like that.
I have gotten some questions, and I feel for people who are in a sense caught in between, because they're really just doing virtual public schooling, which really isn't the same thing as homeschooling, because
Yeah.
they don't have a choice of their
It's the worst of
curriculum,
both worlds.
how to do it. I think they're getting the worst of both worlds. I really do. I feel for them.
Yeah. hmm Well, what I wanted to talk to you about, so Dr. McGrew is an expert on the reliability of the Gospels and sort of understanding different philosophical approaches for understanding the authenticity and reliability of testimony, and even probability theory and how that sort of works into that, and how that can work into us understanding the reliability, the authorship, and the all of those sort of related issues around the Gospels in particular. And so that's something that you have been focusing a lot on, I think, especially recently. And that's what I wanted to sort of have be the main topic tonight. And then, of course, we will eventually probably get to how that relates to the topic of Christology. But I think before we get there, I didn't fully realize this when I started wondering if you might be a good guest for my show, but I sort of stumbled into something of a philosophical spat or argument where there is you and Dr. Licona, and you guys kind of have, a satellite of allies on either side, have been talking a lot about what you might call literary devices, or sort of, and I guess I'll ask you to go into this, but basically, are the Gospels historically reported to represent true facts to the best of the author's ability, or did the authors have some amount of liberty and artistic license to maybe change it a little bit or to dress up the story in certain ways? And so sort of what's the border between that and being historical, or that and starting to fictionalize and deviate from the facts? And so I've had to do a fair amount of homework to catch up on the details of this debate, and the weeds are pretty deep, but it's an interesting question. So I thought that it would be helpful maybe if you could sort of explain what historical devices are and how people like Dr. Licona and some of his people who agree with him define them, and how they relate that to how they understand how the Gospels were written.
Sure, and I think as they themselves would present it, they would say that the Gospels are in a particular genre where the authors had this historical flexibility in how they reported the facts, and they would usually say that they had flexibility concerning details. And so they would use the word details, and the examples that they will most spontaneously give in public presentations will indeed usually be things that would be thought of as details. So recently, for example, Dr. Craig Keener was giving an interview, and he gave as an example that in one story, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand, and then Luke says that it was the man's right hand. And so Dr. Keener's own spontaneous example of flexibility was that Luke might have made up that it was his right hand, and Luke didn't really have any source for that. He said he might have had another source, but we don't know. But that would have been the kind of thing that they would have felt that they had flexibility on, and that's a detail. The range, however, of what is taken to count as details is very broad, to the point where Dr. Licona and Dr. Dan Wallace, for example, have said that John invented the saying from the cross, "I am thirsty, I thirst," and the saying from the cross, "It is finished," and that he was, in a sense, we might say, inspired by a completely different saying. I thirst would be his drastic reworking of, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" So that would be something much stronger. Or, for example, Dr. Licona has suggested that some of the apparent discrepancies in the resurrection narratives might arise from the idea that John moved Jesus' appearance to Mary Magdalene. Well, when you look into what that would amount to, that would amount to John's having crafted that whole scene. It would have to, because it's supposed to be a conflict between John and Matthew. And if Mary Magdalene was with the other women who saw Jesus in Matthew, it's just a completely different set of circumstances. They've already seen the angels, they're joyful, whereas Mary Magdalene is weeping. She thinks he's still dead, and then sees him and she's alone, and so forth. Completely different circumstance. So if John, quote unquote, moved it, I would not call that a detail. I would call that inventing an entire scene. So even though the way they'll initially present it as details, then when you get into the details of their own views, they do end up suggesting a number of things that are broader, but that supposedly was allowed by the genre and the conventions of their time. That would be their model and their claim.
Right. And so they talk a lot about this genre of Greco-Roman biography, and that there was this idea that there were sort of standards of the time. And they even go so far as to say that there was sort of like manuals that maybe people would learn in school about how to, tell a story for dramatic and sort of rhetorical effect, and that this was something that was understood by both author and audience in terms of a way that you could and probably should tell a story if you were giving a kind of biography of the matter. And so I guess the question, I'm sorry, I'm catching you a little off guard. I didn't prepare you for that question, but so the question would be, is exactly how do people like Dr. Licona and his allies understand the genre, and what sort of license that may have given authors?
Well, it varies a lot. They themselves will say that that it's a wide genre, and that some people are on the more loose side and some people are on the less loose side, and so forth. And it's kind of surprising to see just how far it goes. And then basically what they end up doing is what I call discrepancy hunting. They simply go to the Gospels, and if they find something that appears to be a discrepancy, they immediately say, "Oh, maybe this was one of these, literary devices where one of the authors changed it." I don't want to take us, as you said, far off into the weeds. I've done a huge amount of work, and people can find this in my video series and my book. All of that about the manuals is wrong. I mean, I argued at great length and carefully. It's wrong on every single level. The gospel authors probably didn't even have any acquaintance with those manuals, with the possible exception of Luke. The manuals didn't even teach what they're saying they taught. Anyway, the audience would not broadly have been acquainted with that. And once again, the manuals weren't really teaching what they're saying they taught. They've radically misunderstood them. And then to make it even stranger, Dr. Licona doesn't even claim to have found in these manuals many of the various literary devices that he himself is claiming. So it's not like he can say, oh yeah, that's discussed here and that's discussed here. Many of the things that are most prominent in his work, like moving the day when something happened or whatever, he doesn't even have a chapter and verse that he claims is in the manual. So and he says this explicitly in his book, that he's that historians, it's in the realm of informed guesswork. So there is a misunderstanding sometimes that they're claiming they could just read out of these manuals. Oh, see, here it said, and when you are writing history, you are allowed to change when things happened, and you are allowed to. And they don't say that. And they wouldn't have been trained in this, and so there's just a lot of problems with that thesis, and it gives, I think, a false air of or a faulty air of objectivity to the claim, as if there's all this independent evidence that we can just go out and find and read, and well, there it is, so Lydia must be wrong. And it's just not like that at all. It's highly conjectural instead. So that's kind of where they think they're getting it from. And then as far as where the Gospels fall in this, they just basically go by how many differences they think they find. So then when you have a gospel that appears to be or is taken to be a lot different, like John, then it's like, oh, well, then he must be using a lot more of these devices just because he's different. So it's very, I guess I would say it's in a way a kind of an a priori approach, that you conclude that that's what they're doing, and then every little difference is attributed to that. And I don't think that's a good historical approach.
Sure. So I think that a good analogy that you have in the book is that we Americans or modern Westerners are relatively used to the idea of a movie being based on historical events, where a movie might be mostly true, it might be have feature real characters, or perhaps a mix of real and non-real characters, and be set in a certain date at a certain place, and to track events that might be famous or something like that, whether it's a war or a famous person or what have you. But that Hollywood writers will often take a little bit of liberty with the script to make it a more exciting movie, but they'll often do things where they will put things in the movie that are strictly speaking not historically true.
Right.
And I think an important distinction that you make is that, like, certainly every writer has to make choices about what they're going to include and not include, and what they're going to focus on and not focus on. I could say that yesterday I went to McDonald's and had dinner with some people, or I could say yesterday I went to the McDonald's on the corner of Main and First Street, had a Big Mac and a large fries, and hung out with my friend Joe and talked about politics. And those could be both two things, and for a different audience I might tell a different story for a different purpose. But then there's a distinction where it moves beyond just the author making some editorial decisions about what to include and what to focus on, to actually changing historical facts of the matter, such as either putting words on the mouth of the wrong person, or making up words and inserting them into the mouth of a person, changing the chronology of events, changing location of events, and all of those sorts of things, which cross the line from being, factually true to non-factually true, and that the literary device theorists seem to blur that line.
Yeah, they, when you read enough of their stuff, you can find that they really are saying what you've just, I think, aptly summarized. But then there's a lot of wrangling about terminology, and I find this very tedious. They become offended at the word fictional, and I define it. I'm like, this is just a descriptive term. This is just a descriptive term. This isn't, an insult. I mean, like, I like a lot of fictional movies,
Yeah.
I like a lot of even semi-fictional movies. So I'm not trying to insult anybody, but it just is what you're claiming, and I define it out. And so then we all get kind of hung up on terminology. So then I tried to change it to fact changing. I thought, well, maybe the word fictional is triggering people or something. I'll change it to fact changing. And then in Dr. Licona's recent video series, he even objected to that. And it was very odd. So it's this weird feeling like we're not allowed to call things what they are, or we have to use euphemisms or something, which to me bogs the conversation down. But the fact of the matter is that Dr. Licona himself has made the analogy to a movie based on true events. That isn't even originally my analogy. That's originally his analogy. So, I mean, this is definitely what, what he's saying. And the interesting thing is that when you watch a movie like that, it's well done. It's realistically done. So if you want to know whether those things really happened that way, you have to like go look it up on a website or something to find
Right.
out. And so you can't tell just by watching the movie. And in the same way, the theory is that even the original audience could not tell just by reading the gospel. They, but then the idea is they didn't really care. Okay. But where else would they have looked it up? I mean, it's not
Right.
like they had some website that was going to tell them. So it would have really very significantly altered even their ability to tell what really happened in Jesus' life. Like, for example, where did Mary Magdalene meet Jesus? And did
Hmm.
she have that dialogue with him and so forth? They might have been unsure. So at this point, we get brought in this theory that ancient people didn't care, like we're hung up that we care. They didn't really care. I would actually, if anything, reverse it. I would say, if anything, we're a little more cynical and they were a little more, you know,
More optimistic or
gullible or
trusting.
whatever
Yeah.
word you want to use. And we're sort of like, oh, yeah, I know politicians all lie or whatever, but you will actually find a lot of harmonization going on in the ancient church fathers, with the exception of Origen, but he is an exception. And you'll even
Origin is
find
an exception on many things.
he is, and you'll even find what are sometimes called harmonizing scribal activities, where a scribe might, write in some words from the synoptics or something. You can actually tell that he's done that. And again, I think that shows this kind of almost more literal mindset than what
Yeah.
we have. So
I think
anyway.
that's a very good point, that you can see early Christians starting to wrestle with these questions, and virtually none of them say seemingly what Dr. Licona and them say, that, oh, hey, people 1,000 years from now, chill out. We have this standard where we can, take a little bit of, enjoyment and making some, literary flourishes to help make our stories more exciting. But I think, like, when you think about it, like, for a movie based on true events, there isn't a banner that pops up at the top or bottom of the screen when it's like, oh, this part is actually not true, but keep enjoying the movie, folks.
Mhm.
And so, like, you can imagine someone coming out of the movie thinking that they had learned a decent amount of history. And the thing is that, maybe they have. Maybe they see Titanic for the first time and they learn a lot about the Titanic and the
Mhm.
size of the boat, and
Mhm.
the different classes and how they lived in different compartments and all sorts of things. And then you tell them, well, there was actually no person named Rose on the boat, or whatever, and like, and then the weird thing is they suddenly, they won't be able to know which of the details that they've learned from that movie are true or false,
They'll
right?
Google it.
They'll Google it, and there's suddenly this base level of suspicion that creeps in on the
Mhm.
whole thing, where it's like, oh, well, I thought I learned this, but maybe I'm not quite sure.
Mhm.
And I think that there is something deeply acidic about, epistemologically, about the idea of insisting that the authors can change things without you or the other original readers knowing, unless you're able to cross-check it with something more reliable.
That's absolutely right. And this is one distinction that I make as an epistemologist between that view, that literary device view, and an honest error.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
think about it, if somebody makes an honest error, we have a kind of a baseline idea. And I know you mentioned you're a statistician. So, we have an idea of how often people who are close to the facts and are trying as hard as they can to get it right make an honest error on a particular kind of thing. And it might depend on what kind of thing it is, how hard it is for them to remember or whatever. And that is not as acidic It's not
Yes.
nearly as acidic. And I will ask people to put themselves imaginatively on a jury, and someone is being cross-questioned, and he says that an event happened on a Wednesday. Then he's cross-questioned by the other lawyer, the opposing lawyer, and the opposing lawyer forces him to admit that it really happened on a Saturday. Like he shows that it contradicts some other witness on the stand. Now, okay, now the scenario diverges. First scenario, the guy says, "Oh my goodness, you're right. I am so sorry. I remember now, it was a Saturday, but several of those days of the week were similar. That's why I forgot," etc. Okay. In scenario 2, the witness says, "Oh yeah, I knew it was a Saturday. I changed it to make it a more interesting story."
Hmm.
Which of these would more radically change your view as the juror of everything else that guy said?
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, second would have a more radical effect. Why is that? Well, because we know that I mean, just in general, if you're trying to get it right, you're more likely to get it right than if you're actually not even trying to get it right. I mean, that's just sort of basic
Hmm.
common sense. So that's why, even though I myself am not an inerrantist about uh, the Bible, I am I regard my view as inerrancy friendly. And I
Yeah.
tend to get along really well with inerrantists because they like it, first of all, that I just outright, if I think something's an error, I just call it an error. I don't try to call it something else. And so they like that honesty. But then, second of all, I think they can see the way that these literary devices actually cast a much wider doubt over the details in the Gospels, even than my personal views do. And then thirdly, they can see that when I defend the reliability of the Gospels, they can use all that stuff that I say, right? They can use it. They're just going to defend they're going to go even farther with it.
Right. And I think that like you said, inerrancy is the elephant in the room. You had a chapter or a section on that right at the beginning of your
Mm-hmm.
book, which I thought was very good. It seems like a big something at the root of this debate is the idea that scripture being inspired by the Holy Spirit will need to be absolutely true by some definition or another, and that there are these problems between the gospels. What day of the week did Jesus get crucified on? And did Jesus cleanse the temple during Holy Week? Did he do it 3 years earlier? Did he do it twice? Those sorts of things that cause, how did Judas die? A
It's a
couple of
fave.
the that's Bart Ehrman's favorite.
It's his
um
fave.
and so there are those sorts of difficult questions where it's like, well, either I need to do some difficult harmonization on some of them. And there's kind of a spectrum of how harmonizable some of these things are. So either I need to be able to harmonize every single last one of them, or I need a slightly different understanding of what it means for these to be true. And what I think Dr. Licona and the literary device theorists are doing is trying to say that God works by the standards of the time,
Mm-hmm.
and that the standards of the time had these literary devices, see these kind of ancient rhetorical manuals. And so therefore we can cut them slack or something like
Yeah.
that, and that we can attribute these errors to the intention of the authors as opposed to being perhaps mistakes of the authors.
It's astounding to me that that is appealing to someone who calls himself an inerrantist. It just, every time I come back to it, it astonishes me anew. And then I'll meet with someone like Phil Fernandez. I have a 2-part interview with him. He's an old style inerrantist online, and I feel like I've come back out of the twilight zone into the world of the inerrantists that I've known all my life. I was raised by inerrantists. I went to an inerrantist Bible college, and those were the other kind of inerrantists,
Yeah.
okay, where word magic doesn't work on them. All right.
Hmm.
And you go, this isn't an error. These aren't the droids you're looking for. These are literary devices. And they go, these are literary devices. No, they go, yeah, it's still an error because the information is false, because
Hmm.
that's what they care about, is whether the information is false. But it's like, like some thing where somebody's walking along and he trips and he goes, I meant to do that. And is it better if he meant to do that? Well, the milk is still on the floor. Okay, so there's this weird idea that if we just call it something different, if we just say it's not an error, it's a literary device, shoo, I could still hold my inerrantist card. And that just, I can't get over the fact that people would rather do that than either A, harmonize, B, call it an error, or C, say, I don't know.
Right.
I mean, you don't think there was ever a time in Norm Geisler's life where he said he didn't know? I'm sure there was. They're all of the most famous, most diehard, old-fashioned inerrantists have had those things where they're like, you know what, this is a difficult one, and it might be this, might be something I haven't thought of yet. And that's not being mysterious. Scientists do that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Scientists all the time have theories where they're like, you know what, I don't know what the explanation is of the way that particle behaved or whatever. So for whatever reason, people do not want to take any of those three options. They'd rather call it a literary device, and then they feel like they've got this kind of magic wand and they can just wave it over all of these things, and then harmonization gets a worse and a worse rap, which I think
Yeah.
is not good historically either. So yes, I think you've pegged it, and that's a lot of where the appeal lies, at least to evangelicals.
Right. That you can kind of funnel your definition of what it means for the Bible to be true or the Word of God through the intention of the author, and then we can kind of move this literary device idea into what was possibly the intention of the author, and that. But then it still has this troubling effect that I think that you are right to absolutely pin down, is
Mm-hmm.
that there's a difference between a fictionalizing literary device and a non-fictionalizing one.
Yeah.
It's one thing, and I guess here's another thing that we could talk about is paraphrase,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because this is an important concept, right? Because there are, speeches, there's the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, and they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. And, well, maybe it was two different sermons. Well, it seems quite likely. And maybe it was just sort of a general milieu of Jesus gave the same sort of speech over and over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
and they're, giving different versions of it. But could you talk about, sort of different understandings of paraphrasing and how that fits in with this discussion?
Yeah, and it's interesting how a confused presentation of the literary device view can actually lead to a kind of a straw man of my view. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so if you say, if someone presenting the literary device view says, well, I'm just saying that it was possible to paraphrase, or that the gospel authors may have paraphrased, and Lydia McGrew disagrees with me. Well, what does that mean, right? That means Lydia McGrew thinks it was not possible for the authors to paraphrase, which is not true. So um, we need to think in terms, I believe, of recognizable paraphrase. And so I give some examples that I make up in the book, The Mirror of the Mask, where I say, someone could say something about, I'm not going to try to quote it here, but about how he doesn't like the city council and so forth. I give this little thing. Suppose this is what Bob actually said, and then suppose that I report that this is what Bob says. And when I report it, some of the words are somewhat different, but I haven't changed the setting. It's like, nope, this is really, if I say that's when he said it, then that's when he said it. And if you had been there, you could have recognized it. You could have said, oh yeah, that must be, what she told me about or whatever, like if you saw a video or something of it.
Mm-hmm.
So recognizable paraphrase is different from a kind of a strange concept that would not normally be called paraphrase at all, that I alluded to earlier when I talked about I am thirsty and my God, why have you forsaken me? It's just not a paraphrase. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if you put a fancy, Latin phrase on it, ipsissima vox, the very voice. This is not even on the face of it the same meaning. I am thirsty. It's literal. It's supposed to be he actually was, thirsty. In fact, in John, they go and they get
The Roman guards understood what he meant.
right. The people go get wine, sour wine to give him, and so forth. Whereas, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is profound theological thing, and people debate, was the Son really separated from the Father on the cross and all this stuff, or was he just quoting Psalm 22, or maybe both? So they don't even on the face of them appear to mean the same thing. To call that paraphrase, I think is going to really confuse people. So there's that. But then we also get things that fall in between those. So, one of those that I was talking about obviously is paraphrase. And Dr. Licona will talk about, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed versus, the kingdom of heaven is a mustard seed. Or say these itty bitty, trivial differences that obviously fall within recognizable paraphrase versus the I thirst. But then there could be, something in between. So like I literally saw somebody online today, he was trying to make the Gospel of Mark vivid, and Mark uses the word immediately a lot. And so this person was saying, so let's say that that's like boom. So when Mark says, and immediately Jesus did this, let's give that as boom, Jesus did this, boom, Jesus did that. Now he was being very self-conscious in bringing that into a modern idiom, changing immediately to boom, and that, that falls somewhere in between. Right? I mean, it's obvious that Mark isn't actually saying boom,
Yeah.
but we can get that, we can get, so Adam says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. You could give something that you might actually call a dynamic equivalent where Adam, if we imagine Adam as saying, I am, you are part of me. Or something like that. You are a part of my very self or something. It's got a more modern sound, but it still falls within recognizable. And one of the things I talk about is that there's a philosophical problem called the beard problem. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Sometimes it's called the sorites, which is the heap. So you start out with a grain and you add another grain and you add, and when does it become a heap? Or a man hasn't shaved and he's got 5 o'clock shadow, but 2 days later we might say it's a beard. And then it's like it's on a quasi continuum.
Yeah.
Where we have a problem is where somebody says, because you could put these on a quasi continuum, there are no clear cases. So because you could go on a quasi continuum from an absolutely trivial verbal difference over to making something up, or it's just obvious you're making something up, does that mean there are no clear cases because there's some sort of gray area in between? No, it obviously doesn't mean that. And we recognize this in all sorts of practical matters of daily life. In fact, the law could not be applied. What's speeding? Is going 1 nano thing over the speed limit speeding? Oh, maybe not. But he's going 10 miles. Oh, yes. Okay. So we try to call it on the clear cases. So that's what I do with paraphrase. I say, well, whatever else paraphrase is, that isn't it. And yet, of course, I would acknowledge that the gospel authors, because they wouldn't have had a verbatim memory, paraphrased Jesus' words.
Right. And so a thing that is sort of in this gray area on the spectrum is that I think that even people who have just read some classical literature, like even if you've just read, like, say, some Platonic dialogues, right, we sort of imagine that Plato is after the fact maybe putting words in Socrates's mouth or whoever else's mouth to kind of make them perhaps even sound smarter than they could be on the spot, and to kind of maybe almost like make them be a better version of their argument than sort of a natural human being might be, to the point where it's manufacturing speeches and probably giving them a lot of words that they didn't say. And then, and Plutarch seems to do similar things, and Plutarch seems to be right in the middle of this debate. And that's sort of one of those things where there does seem to have been a lot of classical precedent for giving a protagonist and maybe even an antagonist a speech to give or a dialogue to have that is sort of in the spirit of the person, but not very, I could have gone back in time with a tape recorder and found that speech.
Well, speeches and dialogues are somewhat different, and we do need to distinguish them. I actually think Plato's dialogues are a little unusual in that respect, and also they're hundreds of years prior to the Gospels.
Right, yeah.
They're also highly philosophical and so forth, and I think they look kind of artificial right on their face, frankly. I have a whole discussion in the book that's with the publisher right now, The Eye of the Beholder, of the dialogues in John, and how different from that they are, how realistic they are. The people insult Jesus, they go off topic, they jump from one topic to another. Jesus insults them back. It's not like a Platonic dialogue at all. It's actually
right.
pretty nitty gritty.
Or it's not even like Justin and the dialogue with Trypho, right? Which is a Christian document.
I don't even know if Trypho existed. Yeah.
Right. Right, where that one seems to be self-consciously imitating a Platonic dialogue, I would say.
It
Yeah.
might be. Yeah, I don't think he was necessarily trying to get you to believe, in the actual existence of Trypho even, it was a
Mm-hmm.
representative Jewish dialogue. But um, as far as speeches, then that's this whole thing, and I have a chapter on that. Um, when an author invented a speech, there were authors in ancient times who invented a speech. It was a chance to show off his rhetorical chops. It was like an exercise in being a really good speech writer. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so they're set piece for one thing. They're clearly set apart from and he said and then it's a big long thing. Um, the discourses we have, even in the Gospel of John, don't look like that. They
Mm-hmm.
don't have that kind of appearance as being rhetorically trained. There's no appearance. In fact, when people talk about Johannine style, it's sometimes forgotten that Johannine style isn't all that good.
Yeah.
I mean, as Greek,
Mm-hmm.
okay, it's simple. It uses fewer conjunctions. It tends to be choppy, and
It's
so
blunt. Yeah.
blunt, yeah, that too. Shorter sentence structure and so forth. So the last thing it looks like is a highly trained rhetor showing off his chops.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
That's a good point.
and so then the other thing we want to notice too is that a ancient author who did make up a speech would then maybe have much higher standards for the surrounding factual material. So he would, like Tacitus, for example, pretty clearly did make up speeches, and yet modern scholars, I think rightly, thought of him as very scrupulous about chronology, to the point where when they found an inscription that they thought contradicted Tacitus, and then some of them later changed their minds and said, no, it didn't contradict Tacitus, they were like shocked. It like shook the world of Tacitus scholarship. So that business about him making up speeches, it didn't tend to spread to his other facts. It
Interesting.
was kind of interesting. It was
Cordoned off. Yeah.
cordoned
Quarantine.
off. So I
Mm-hmm.
talk about that in the book as well. I see no evidence whatsoever, even for Luke, who was the most probably Hellenistically trained. His Greek is the highest in the New Testament, with the possible exception of the
Of
author of
Hebrews.
Hebrews,
Yeah.
who may have been Luke, by the way. So for that matter, but even there, it's interesting. You can go to like the speeches of Paul in Acts, and I know this is a controversial opinion, but they vary.
Mm-hmm.
They vary with his audience in these very realistic ways. And the speech of Paul differs from the speech of Peter
Mm-hmm.
in ways that I think it doesn't look like Luke showing off. It looks like Luke actually recording. Maybe somebody reported it to him. In some cases, I think he was there. So
Interesting. Yeah. So I probably should have given you an opportunity earlier, but how would you describe your historical reportage model and sort of what distinguishes it? You talked about sometimes people automatically jump to the opposite end of the spectrum with what you must be saying. So how would you put what you're saying in your own words?
So, short version, the gospel authors were trying to get it right all the time. They never tried to change anything, and they were highly successful. So, that's my very short version. But this doesn't preclude their having to recognizably paraphrase. It also doesn't preclude their sometimes narrating in a way that is not in chronological order, but they're not trying to imply something contrary to the real chronological order. And we can talk some more about that. And of course, it doesn't mean that they didn't make selections, as you yourself were talking about, I think, correctly before. So, but yet, nevertheless, if they say something, it's because they believe that it's true. And then they weren't just gullible, they were actually getting it right. They were very highly reliable. So that's how I would characterize it briefly.
Mm-hmm. And so I think another really important definition is reliable. And there are sort of different flavors of reliable, and then that sort of relates into how we treat them as history and understand what we can make of the facts that they report. So how would you define reliable, and even what are the different flavors of reliability?
Sure, sure. Well, something that's come to be popular that I don't agree with now is using the word reliable of a document to mean that we can get facts out of it. So you were talking earlier about going and seeing, Titanic, and that's like obviously fiction, and yet we can get facts out of it,
Hmm.
right? I mean that the Titanic struck a, that it
It
sunk,
left, it
right?
left, yeah, New York, and then it hit an iceberg, and it was a big boat,
Right,
and the
exactly.
people dressed the way they dressed, and some people were
Right.
Irish, and some people were American, et cetera, et cetera, et
Right,
cetera.
right,
Yeah,
right. And I haven't actually seen the movie, but I think they do have the orchestra playing on
yeah.
the deck when it's sinking. That's a historical fact. So you can get historical facts out of it. That's not what I would take to be reliable, but people will use it that way. And it'll be interesting to see. Someone will be debating Bart Ehrman, like Craig Evans or Michael Licona will be debating Bart Ehrman. Are the Gospels historically reliable? And then you'll start hearing, and I think we can really get a portrait of Jesus out of the Gospels, or some words to that effect. Dr. Evans will say, and Bart will say, and here I have to see his point, but that's not what people would normally mean by reliable. So putting it non-technically, what we usually mean by reliable is that we can rely on something. And that's sort of using a word to define a word, but that we can depend, maybe I'll use a synonym there. And the way I will define it non-technically is that if something comes from a source, that constitutes a strong reason to think that it happened. Now, it's not an indefeasible reason. You could change your mind. You might get counter evidence and say, "Oh, I guess he got that wrong," but that at least it creates a strong case. You were mentioning to me in our email correspondence ahead of time that you're a statistician, you like probability theory. So um, I like to talk in my probability work about Bayes factors. And a Bayes factor, I usually use the simple ratio model as a measure of evidential strength.
Hmm.
So when I use the word reliable, I usually mean that it has a strongly top-heavy Bayes factor.
Yeah.
So that you can plug that in, and that constitutes a pretty strong evidence that it happened just for it to be stated by that source. So that if John says that Jesus said such and such, then we don't have to say, "Oh, gee, I don't know. Does that fulfill one of the other criteria of authenticity?" And it's too hard for historians to tell because we don't have any special evidence about that. Saying no, if John is reliable, and of course I argue, it's not like I just assume it, right? But if John is reliable, then just the fact that that saying is in John is strong reason to think that Jesus actually said it. I mean, it's not even a miracle for Jesus to stand up and say something. So even if you have a
Hmm.
bias against miraculous, for Jesus to make a statement it's not even miraculous. So um, that's how I define it, that it's strong reason to believe that it happened, though it could be counteracted or defeated. Now, I'll define minimal reliability as just meaning that it's some reason to think that it happened. So
Yeah.
this would just be like it has somewhat of a top heavy.
Maybe a greater than 50-50 just based off of pure
Well,
reportage. Yeah.
and the way, how a Bayes factor works, it's like an odds,
Yeah.
right? The odds of this evidence, if this were true, versus the probability of this evidence if this were false. So
Yeah.
we think of someone as just being white noise. We don't listen to him at all. If we think he's just as likely to say something if it's true as he's
Yeah.
likely to say it if it's false, right? It's like he's useless, right? He's just a
Right.
random
Right.
number generator, right? So a minimal reliability would be that it's better than that
Yeah,
it's at
yeah,
least some
that's a
reason to
good
think
point.
that it
50-50 would actually be pretty bad if, now that I'm thinking about it, for someone
right?
just spewing
It's just
out facts. It's just a coin flip whether I'm telling you something true or not about Jesus.
right.
And
You
in
don't
fact,
right.
if I was less than 50-50, you could just invert the statement to suddenly make me more
Some reason
reliable.
against it, exactly.
Yeah.
So you think of the boy who cried wolf. How do the villagers come to think of the boy who cried wolf? They don't listen to him at all, right?
Mm,
Now then he happens to be right one time and then he gets eaten by the wolf, right? So he's fooled them so many times that they just come to treat his statements as white noise. So minimal reliability is that it's better than that. And then when I use the term reliability, I usually mean high reliability, that it's much better than that I can
yeah.
just say, well, probably this is good reason to think it happened, though I could change my mind.
Right. And then you can imagine if we have multiple people talking about the same thing, we could hierarchically rank people by their reliability, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
based off of past experience or credentials or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they contradict each other, we normally sort people by their reliability and take the higher against the lower until proven otherwise.
Or we try to harmonize them, or
Yeah.
if we can ask
Hmm.
them questions, that might help. We might be able to sort it out or whatever. But right, if you've got an actual contradiction, then you're gonna have to make your pick.
Right. All right. So I think it would be helpful to maybe go over an example or two
Mm-hmm.
that are sort of like maybe a passage that's sort of like a key that highlights the difference between how a literary device theory might treat it versus how a historical reportage model might treat it.
Yeah, so I've already sort of introduced this one, so I can maybe continue with this. When did Mary Magdalene see Jesus after he rose from the dead? Okay, obviously a skeptic doesn't think he rose from the dead at all, but we're, trying to see if the accounts can be put together or not. So in Matthew 28, it says that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to the tomb, and then after naming them, then it just says they. Just says they for the
Mm-hmm.
rest of the thing. Um, and they see the stone rolled away and so forth. The angel says to them, he's not here, for he's risen, and all of that. And they run away with great joy to tell the disciples. And it says, and while they were going, they saw Jesus. And then they seize his feet and so forth, and he gives them a message for the disciples. So that's when they see Jesus. All right. Now, if you just read Matthew by itself, he names Mary Magdalene at the beginning, and then he just says they. You would naturally interpret it. Your first impression would be that she was one of them who went through this whole thing, and that then she saw Jesus when leaving the tomb like that.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go over to John 20, and um, and Mary Magdalene does come to the tomb, though it doesn't mention that she's with anyone else. And it says she sees the stone rolled away. She runs and finds Peter and John, and then she comes back and she's weeping, and she sees this man who's Jesus, but she thinks he's the gardener. And she says, "Where have you laid him, that I may take him away?" And he says her name,
Mm-hmm.
Mary. It's this wonderful scene. She recognizes it, and then she says, "Rabbi," and falls at his feet. Okay, these are very different accounts. So the approach that Dr. Licona takes is that you take your first impression, and I'm sorry to have to say this is also the approach that Dr. Ehrman takes. You take your first impression of each account, you fix it,
Mm-hmm.
you fix it in place, you don't change it. And then if those two first impressions are in contradiction, then the idea is that one or the other of these authors must change something. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so Dr. Licona is very definite that either John or Matthew must have moved, relocated is his word, where Mary met Jesus. Now, for John, as I mentioned before, to have relocated, it would be to invent an entire scene because the circumstances are so different. For Matthew, would be for Matthew to suppress that if he deliberately relocated, to say, "I know she saw him in this private interview, but I'm going to make her see Jesus first with the other women." So my approach instead would be to say, well, how could we put these together? And I don't think it's very strained at all. Now, we may say maybe Matthew didn't know about the scene in John, but he doesn't actually assert that it didn't happen. He
Mm-hmm.
just leaves it
Mm-hmm.
out, right? Just doesn't show any awareness of it. I think Mary left the group, and I often say that to too many New Testament scholars, the people in the Bible, they're like freeze frame photos, whereas real people are like a movie. Not in the
Mm-hmm.
sense of being made up, but in the sense that they move, right? They don't stay with the group, that they were with. So, all right, Mary left the group. The others went on and had the experience that Matthew describes, and then she came back later and saw Jesus at the tomb. And I think that's actually pretty economical harmonization. So that's an example of the difference. But then I want to give another example of the difference that doesn't involve an apparent discrepancy, because I think this is, in a sense, even more striking.
Sure.
So this was in Dr. Licona's recent series of videos. He was talking about Jesus' dialogue with Pontius Pilate. He acknowledged that one part of it is actually confirmed by an undesigned coincidence. We may discuss those later, where Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." But then, like, it's just a couple sentences later, Jesus says, "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And Dr. Licona suggested, he said, maybe John thought that this was a good time to remind his readers of the place where Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice." So maybe John embellished by inventing that Jesus said, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Now, I just want to point out there is no contradiction, not even an apparent contradiction, not any discrepancy at all that anybody could ever bring up between John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke on this. It's just a bit of dialogue that they don't report. That's it.
Right.
Okay. Now, he then hastened to say, now I'm not saying that's what happened. He said, but this just could be, and then he said something like, it is impossible for historians to tell. Historians cannot tell. Now, to me, that sort of epitomizes the difference. That what you're doing is you're going sentence by sentence through the dialogue. You're admitting that this sentence of the dialogue is even confirmed. And then you're going to just a couple sentences later, and you're going, I don't know, maybe he made it up. I'm not saying he did, but
Yeah.
it's
And
impossible to know. And to me, it's like, why would you do that? The very fact that you have evidence that John knew what happened in this dialogue, which you've just admitted, should lead us to think that this isn't made up either.
And that's what gets really topsy-turvy about the literary device model, is like you would seemingly only be able to make arguments for it if you had some evidence that wasn't generated by a literary device model, right? If you've got two gospel accounts, right, and you're trying to figure out when Jesus saw Mary Magdalene or what Jesus said to Pontius Pilate, and you think that both of them are coming from the same sort of literary device liberty sort of paradigm, well, then how can you say, oh, well, I'm pretty sure that Matthew's getting that part of the dialogue right, so therefore we can see the dialogue in John is literizing. But how would you know a priori which direction to go,
To
or
pick.
which any of them? It seems that you're on such quicksand either way that you can't play them off of each other like that if they're both generated that way.
Well, it's interesting to see what happens in practice. One thing that happens in practice is a huge emphasis on multiple attestation.
Mm-hmm.
So, the way I like to put this is everything has to be reported twice. Like you can't know that it happened unless it's reported twice. So there's that. If something is multiply attested. A second thing that we get is a constant move to a higher and higher level of generality. Jesus talked to Pontius Pilate, right? He had some kind of a dialogue with Pontius Pilate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's, so what ends up being multiply attested may not even be anything so specific, but, it can be at a higher level of generality. So you'll see this in Dr. Licona's book on the resurrection. The disciples had group appearances of Jesus. And then he says whether any of the particular group appearances were the way that it really happened may be going beyond what the historical data can warrant. But so you go up to this very high level of describing. They had some kind of group appearances. So that's another thing that happens. A third thing that happens is they love Mark. Okay, it's just, if you have to pick for whatever reason, and I just think it's a scholarly bias. I'm sorry.
It's just a priori decision, really.
It's a scholarly bias. It's like Mark, if we got to pick, we're gonna usually say Mark is historical, and anything that's added to or not confirmed by Mark is more questionable. And I see that movement all the time.
Right. Right. And I can understand how probability theory will start to play into this. So I'll take a little detour and I'll bring it back. One of my favorite games is code names or code words. I should probably be able to remember the name of one of my favorite games. But it's so you have there are two teams. You have a 5x5 grid of words. So you've got 25 words. And I think, what is it? 10 of them belong to me, 10 of them belong to my opponent, 4 of them are neutral, and 1 of them is you lose the game. And so imagine you're my partner, and I've got these 10 words. I know which 10 words are mine, are ours, but you don't know. And I get to say one word, imagine some of our words are cat, soda can, and rainbow. I'm like, man, what words can I say? What one word can I say to try to unite all 3 of those? And I'll pick, I don't know, like fairy tale or whatever. And then you'll be like, oh, fairy tale. Well, here's the word unicorn over here. And I'm like, oh no, I didn't mean for you to pick that word. And it's really
like taboo.
It is like taboo.
It's like a higher level taboo. Yeah.
Yes, and I love the game because there's a lot of probability theory that works into it, but it's also a verbal game, which means that my wife likes it.
Well,
So
the other thing is you don't want to pair romantic partners or married people in that, because they know too many
yes,
things they
yes,
can use to
they
help
have a
them.
thicker commonality that
Right,
they can
right,
reference when they're picking their words.
right.
But I think everyone should play this game because you just eat humble pie and how hard it is to communicate and you see how easy it is to be misunderstood. Because once you've said, fairy tale 3 words, then you can't talk, and then you
Mhm.
listen to this other person. Well, I think they were trying to say this, and I think they were trying to say this. And you're like, oh no, no, no,
Well, it's
no.
also like charades in that respect too, very much like charades or Pictionary or any of those, right?
Yes. And so what you can see is the way that this relates. So like what you were saying, so you read the account of Mary Magdalene seeing Jesus after he's resurrected, and you form in your mind what you think is the most likely chronology of events and sequence and cast of characters and stuff like that. And then you read John, and so then you've got these 2 different ones, and like what it seems overly rigid if you were to force someone to commit to their most likely interpretation, right? Like you could maybe ask someone to draw 10 slightly different variations of the same account,
Mm-hmm.
and you could maybe say, well, I think this is the most likely, but it could also been like this, right? And you have a scattering of them, and maybe you would place your probability chips in a lot of them,
Mm-hmm.
and then you do the same thing with John, and you might find that of these 10 most likely versions of the story, 2 or 3 of them actually overlap with each other, and even
Mm-hmm.
if they weren't the highest probability based off of the evidence alone, they
Mm-hmm.
still had a decently high probability and they overlap. And so then the
Mm-hmm.
question is when is it more likely or more prudent or more parsimonious, or however you want to put it,
Mm-hmm.
to pick between a slightly less likely interpretation of the story
Mm-hmm.
or to go with the conclusion that something is wrong. And I
Mm-hmm.
think playing games like Codenames makes you realize it's very easy to misunderstand someone.
Yes,
Eh,
absolutely. Yeah, and we see that especially in chronology. Like if somebody didn't really mean to say that he did this before he did that, it's very easy to think that he was trying to imply an order when he really, he really wasn't. Um,
mhm,
so yeah, the 2 things. First of all, our probability in these areas has to be empirically informed. That's
mhm,
obviously true. And this is one reason why I find that people in police work, people in who've been lawyers who've questioned, witnesses and that kind of thing, they tend to go for the reportage model more, and that's because they have all of this empirical background. Okay, so J. Warner Wallace, for example, I quote him in The Mirror of the Mask as saying, I'm going to bet you that the guy who says that about some sort of literary devices never questioned witnesses.
yeah,
Okay, and so why is this? Well, because you realize how often those supplementary accounts do correct our first impression,
mhm,
right? That if you read Matthew, you got a first impression what happened, but you should allow the supplementary account. So if one witness says, he ran away down the street, and then the other witness said he drove away in his car, you might say, okay, these are in contradiction. But then when you realize the one witness was standing in a position where, he could only see the window here and saw the person starting to run down the street, the other person was standing looking over here, he could see the guy getting into his car, and they're actually both right.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So by
And,
questioning witnesses, we realize the need to take in um, supplementary information. Then the
and
next
to place a relatively low probability on even your most likely interpretation of the
Exactly.
events.
Not to
Yes.
be rigid, not to be like,
Mhm.
nope, 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 that has to be what it means. That's the only thing it can be. And Bart Ehrman is such a bully. And I'm allowed to say this
Yes.
when I'm talking about evangelical Christians, you're not allowed to use words like bully. I do find that people don't get their feelings hurt as much if you say that Bart Ehrman is a bully because he's not thought of as a brother in Christ, but he is. And he'll say, well, if you want to write your own gospel like that, that's how he talks about harmonizing. He'll go, well, that's writing your own gospel, and you can do that if you want, but I'm not sure that that's the best way to deal with the gospels we actually have. And I'm like, I'm sure that's the best way to deal with the Gospels we actually have, because we're treating them the way we actually ought to treat historical sources. I do this with Plutarch too. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I find that sometimes when Dr. Licona is talking, or his mentor, or whatever, his colleague, or whatever you want to call him, Christopher Pelling, this classicist, and they've influenced one another, when they're dealing with Plutarch, they'll make Plutarch contradict himself. And I'll say, you know, it's not clear to me that Plutarch is contradicting himself.
Mm-hmm.
These could both be accurate, and I think you're interpreting him over rigidly. So then the next thing to recognize is that attributing an intention to change the story is itself an added epicycle that you're putting on your theory. So
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
increases theory complexity.
Yeah, which
And
decreases parsimoniousness
it,
and
it, it,
decreases the probability that your model is
exactly.
true. Yeah.
And so this is part of what I'm doing in the book with what I call my flow chart. And some people love the flow chart. Dr. Licona did not like the flow chart.
Yeah,
That's
I heard
fine.
that.
But I'm trying to show the stages of the burden of proof. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
first of all, is there even a contradiction here at all? You know, let's just start there. Is there even an appearance? First of all, is there even an appearance of contradiction? So then is there a real contradiction, you know? And then, well, okay, did the person know he was getting it wrong? So to say that he knew he was getting it wrong as opposed to getting it wrong accidentally, that's yet another thing you have to try to argue for, that he
Mm-hmm.
must have
Mm-hmm.
known. Because
Mm-hmm.
we see people making mistakes all the time. Again, if we're not worrying about inerrancy for the moment, okay, in our common experience, we see people making mistakes more than we see them changing things deliberately. So will that account for it? Okay, so you have to argue that he knew it. Then you have to argue that um, he he had some kind of a motive for putting something different in. It's astonishing to me how often people will not even suggest a motive. You know, like, oh well, maybe, you know, maybe John just embellished that, and it's like, why would he do that? You know, um, and so you have to have this idea that he had this motive to change it. Then the final thing you're adding is that the audience, that there was this wide understanding. Now we're taking on a huge burden of proof. I mean, you realize it would be so easy to prove the existence, if I use prove in the colloquial sense, of movies based on true events in our own time.
Mm-hmm.
If you lived 1,000 years from now and you
Yeah.
had all our records, you could come back, you could find directors' interviews, you
Yep.
could find websites talking about how things were changed. You could, I mean, it's just like everywhere.
Even if you just had a fraction of the evidence survived through time, yeah, there's
Absolutely.
a
It would
mountain
be
of it.
very easy. And you could talk about like how widely available these movies were too. That's another thing. They were part of popular culture. They weren't
Right.
just part of educated culture. Everybody went to the movies and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. And to show that the audience as a whole, the culture as a whole, and also the homogeneity of our culture. There are people in South Korea who watch American movies, right?
Right.
Well, the Korean,
Whereas Judea and Galilee had very distinctive cultures, and
much
Samaria
less
and Asia Minor, and
Asia.
yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so they're taking on, they don't even seem to realize what a burden of proof they're taking on with this final step, that the audience wouldn't have cared. The audience wouldn't have minded. The audience would have realized that, that's the kind of thing the author might do, and they'll just throw it out there. So what I'm trying to do is show, and that's part of what my training in probability has led me to do, to show the layers of complexity and heaviness that are being added to this thesis, and then the insufficiency of the evidence vis-a-vis the heaviness of the thesis.
Yeah, and that's something that people that aren't well trained in science or statistics or probability might not get, is that the more complex you make your theory, the more likely it is to be wrong, not the opposite. Now, if you make your all else being equal,
Right,
now
right,
if adding complexity to your theory makes it suddenly fit the data a lot better,
right,
well,
right.
then the complexity is worth it. But if it only adds maybe a little bit of extra fit, a simpler model that might not have as much good fit, but is still just simpler, could still be better. And this is something that it takes a little bit of statistical training to understand quite
Yeah,
exactly how that works.
yeah,
And so I like your point. I think that sometimes the literary device view gets praised as being slightly more humble or something, because you are not I don't know, it's like you're treating the standards of the time by its own standards or something like
Ah,
that, or not asserting your own cultural viewpoint back onto them or something, so it gets treated with a little bit of humility. But
right.
I actually think that, you know, you can really put the shoe on the other foot with that there's a decent amount of humility in saying like, well, I might not just be right with what my original gut impression of the story was, and
Mm.
that trying to harmonize is actually an act in humility itself.
There's that, and then there's also the question of, well, are they right about the standards of the
Yeah,
time?
well, that's a
And
good
that's part of why
question.
my book is so long.
Yeah.
You know, is that when you get these assertions, okay, this is in the what do you call it, exercise books, this is in the biography, this is in this and that, it's overwhelming to people. I mean, I've had a very highly placed person say to me, well, I don't consider myself qualified to investigate that. And I'm like, yeah, you are, you're qualified to invest. But so I went out and I did it, and I'm not asking anybody to just take my word for it. That's why I wrote a long book. But you don't just get to assert that these were the standards of the time. You know, you have to show it. And I would say they have not shown it. The other thing is there's a certain amount of inconsistency. At times they'll say these are the standards of the time, these are ancient. Lydia's being anachronistic. But more recently, particularly since the book came out, actually, interestingly, what Dr. Licona has taken to saying is this is what we do all the time in ordinary conversation. Now, there's a little tension there between these are the ancient, it's different, they were so different, and oh well, this is what we do all the time in ordinary conversation. Well, if this is what we do all the time now, then it's our standards, then it's
Right.
not actually
And suddenly
special
that
ancient.
layer of worldview distance, or however you want to put it, is starting to disappear.
Is starting to disappear, and then it's like, well, you know what, this isn't what we do all the time in ordinary conversation.
Yeah.
You know, we don't have ordinary conversation, for goodness sake. You stick with the movies based on true event model. That was actually a better model for what you're really trying to say, not casual conversation. Casual conversation is a terrible model.
And maybe we do have some friends that we know tend to embellish or exaggerate, or maybe we can think of certain politicians that might be more prone to exaggerating than others.
Mm-hmm.
But we normally that will start to get exposed the better you get to know someone, and then that lowers your trust of them,
Right.
right? And I can't imagine that it was any different then.
It's not. It's certainly not just accepted.
Yes,
Right. I mean, this is why you can play gotcha on a politician by showing that he lied.
right.
Right,
Yeah.
if it was just accepted, and then we just go, oh well, we have to distinguish. I mean, there's cynical acceptance, there's like, oh yeah, there goes that guy again, but not
Yeah.
moral acceptance, if I can use that word. I think people do kind of say, well, that's not very good, that's not right.
Right.
Go
And even the cynical acceptance has a cost to it,
Yeah,
right? It
yeah.
means that every once in a while when the person that's cynically known to over exaggerate, every once in a while that when they're trying to say something true, even the people that might kind of support them but cynically know not to trust them when they're talking about themselves,
Mm,
will there's a cost to that because they will think it's unlikely to be true.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
So I think that while I do think it's important that there are some worldview gaps, or however you want to put that,
Mhm.
between us and the authors and the audience in the first century, that I don't think that this sort of simple standard of truth and reportage was that different. Because like even in our own times, we can go to different cultures and it seems pretty uniform on that sort of general idea of that you should speak the truth when you're talking.
And I think we can find evidence concerning that time. That's why I have a chapter called Let Ancient People Speak for Themselves. And
Yeah.
I had fun writing that chapter where we actually find very clear ancient standards of truthfulness. And then what will be said is, well, they didn't always live up to them. Well, we don't always live up to them.
Yeah.
Okay, but the point is, what's the statement that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue?
Hmm.
Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue.
Yeah.
The very fact that they asserted them shows that the standard existed, and that they wanted their audience to think that that's what they were doing.
Yeah. Okay, so now I have a question to shift gears a little bit. So the Gospel of John is a little weird. or at least it reads quite differently. The three synoptic gospels read relatively similarly, and they have their own unique flavors. But the Gospel of John, in many ways, seems like an outlier, and you can even quantify some of the outliers, some of the ways in which it's an outlier. And um, I think that, and I know that you're currently writing a book on John, so that John is very much at the top of your mind. So how would you generally approach the question of, well, why does John seem so different then? You know, there are no exorcisms, there are fewer miracles, but spotlights on miracles, you know, and you know, a whole and Jesus keeps running around saying, I am the this or that. And there's all of these arguments with the Jews, and you know, et cetera, all the unique things that keep that are relatively unique to the way that the Gospel of John reads. How would you make sense of that, and how does that fit into this discussion?
Well, yeah, you know, I wouldn't necessarily go with like each thing you listed. Like as far as
Sure.
arguments with the Jews, my goodness, there actually I counted this up a few years ago. Luke has more conflicts with the Pharisees, I think, than any other gospel. Luke and Matthew are closely tied, but I think Luke is the highest, more
Mm-hmm.
than
Mm-hmm.
John. So, but anyway, um, I think we need to get away from the idea that a given gospel is meaning to give a representative sample of what Jesus did and what Jesus said, what themes he addressed, how he talked, and so forth, like that. None of the gospels has a statement at the beginning that says, the deeds and words of Jesus represented in this gospel constitute a representative sample of the kinds of deeds and words that Jesus
Or a
engaged in.
randomly chosen sample or something. Yeah.
Exactly, randomly chosen and therefore, hopefully,
Yeah.
representative, right? None of them say that.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to think that John is self-consciously supplementing the synoptics. And I think that, when you come to like parables, well, you can just imagine John, he's like, the parables have already been done, man. They've been
Yeah.
done to death. We've got lots of parables. I've only got one scroll, man. I want to do something that hasn't already been done. So I think there's a lot of self-conscious supplementation, and we definitely need to get away from this representative sample assumption or random sample assumption. There are topics that we have not discussed here tonight that I discuss a lot in other contexts or with other people. So this isn't a representative sample of, the way Lydia talks
Mm-hmm.
necessarily. In fact, I've sometimes talked about this, the way that I have my homeschooling mom persona and I have my scholar persona, and they're actually rather different. And you can get a little bit of shock when someone who knows me in the one context meets me in the other. It's kind of interesting to see.
Mm-hmm.
So we definitely need to get away from that. So I think that supplementation is a biggie. The other thing is that I would actually, to some extent, challenge the premise. I have sections in the forthcoming book, The Eye of the Beholder, where I show parallels of how Jesus talks and speaks, and they're actually astonishing. So I don't want to steal the thunder of the book too much, but here are just a couple. Matthew 7:7, ask and it will be given to you. John 16:24, it's a completely different context. It's at the Last Supper, whereas the Matthew 7:7 is Sermon on the Mount. All right. John 16:24, ask and you shall receive.
Mm-hmm.
All
Yeah.
right. Or here's a general similarity of manner, asking the relatives if they have faith. So you find in Mark 9:23, all things are possible to him that believes. He's talking to the father of, I believe, a boy who's demon possessed, or he'll ask a person, do you believe that I'm able to do this? Sometimes it's the person himself who wants the miracle. Sometimes it's the relative of the person who's afflicted. Now you go to the raising of Lazarus to Martha. Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Now it's like a completely different context, but it's clearly the same man, the same mind, the same manner. And I have a bunch of these. It's really striking and does not get emphasized. I got quite a few of these from an author named Stanley Leeds. He has like 20 pages of them. Here's a slightly longer one that I like to give. When Jesus is speaking in Luke, he says that you will loose an animal on the Sabbath. He's annoyed with them because they're giving him a hard time over healing on the Sabbath. He says, you will loose an animal to take it to water on the Sabbath. Should I not have loosed this daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for these 18 years? So this was the woman who was bent over. You go over to John. In John 5, Jesus tells the man to take up his bed and walk after he heals him at the pool of Bethesda. It's a healing not given in the synoptics. Then you go to John 7, and he's talking about that because they made a fuss that he healed on the Sabbath. He said, I did one miracle, and you all wondered, you will circumcise a man on the 8th day, that the scripture be not broken, that the law be not broken. I made a man entirely whole on the Sabbath. And you were displeased or whatever. So it's almost like a pun, circumcising on the Sabbath versus making a man whole.
Yeah.
Okay, loosing the animal versus loosing the woman, and so forth. Now these are completely different contexts, different miracles. It's the same turn of mind.
Yeah.
It's the way his mind works. It's astounding. So I think we do need to push back a bit against the idea that that Jesus in particular looks different between the Gospels. The other thing is some of the differences actually involve John's looking, in a sense, more historical. I'm not trying to diss the historicity of the synoptics, but I'll give an example. When Jesus travels in John tends to go into more detail. So it's like he was going to go to Galilee, so he went and found Philip and said, follow me. It's like thinking about going to Galilee. And then he's
referencing the time of year based off of Jewish festivals is something that John does very frequently, more frequently.
Very specific. Or he's up in Galilee, he's going to go, he is going to go to the Festival of Tabernacles, but they don't know that, and his brothers are mocking him. Right?
I sometimes wonder if that's an example of Jesus being a little deceptive, but that's a different question.
He's like trolling them a little bit. Yeah, my time has not yet come or whatever. But what is that? Well, the way I put that is the perspective of the author is always with Jesus, looking where he's going to go. So if he's in the south, he's going to go north. The speaker or the voice is with Jesus looking north. If he's in the north, he's going to go south. The voice is with Jesus looking south. All these kinds of like little unnecessary circumstantial things that don't seem to contribute much to the story, you find them in John. He tells things in more detail. That certainly doesn't make him look less, less historical. And I really think that the synoptics tended to follow each other's selection of material. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that they didn't have independent information. I think they had a lot of independent information about the details of what happened, but I think they tended to sort of follow to some extent each other's outlines, and there is some kind of literary dependence there that's widely agreed upon by scholars. And so I was astounded. I had a debate with Craig Evans, and he said, well, I'm just counting up votes, and it's 3-1 against John. If I said that, everybody would say, see, Lydia is clueless. She doesn't know about the synoptic problem, right? Okay, that the synoptics are not independent in their selection, at least their selection of material, whereas John, I think, is consciously going his own way, so it's not 3-1. So I think that's important.
Yeah, that ignores correlation of the data columns, but yeah, that's interesting. So, I think that one thing that people will say about the Gospel of John is that it is very tailored for perhaps a slightly different context, like imagining John being in Ephesus and there being perhaps people who are running around preaching that John the Baptist is actually the Messiah, not Jesus, and then there being weird Gnostics, and then of course there being every form of paganism that was in the empire at the time, and that John is tailoring his gospel for evangelistic purposes related to his context and his possible audience, both to protect the Christians that he already has from these outside influences, and then maybe to target as evangelism targets these other groups. And so that's why, perhaps why John the Baptist in the Gospel of John goes, it's extremely clear that John the Baptist is not the Messiah in the Gospel of John. He said and did not deny, right, which is actually not putting on the lips. That's a narrative, a narrator's comment and stuff like that. And I find a lot of those sorts of ideas persuasive, but I don't think that it's naturally in disagreement with what you're saying either.
Well, and I think we should realize, what is our evidence that there were people saying that John the Baptist was the Messiah? We've got to watch out for a circular argument here, right? If
Right.
our argument that that was the, as they call it, the sitz im Leben, the situation in life in which the gospel was written, is just the fact that this scene appears, then we can't turn around and act like we have independent evidence that that was going on and then say, maybe this was written to address that. I'm not sure really what other evidence we have that there were people in the surrounding context who were saying that John the Baptist was the Messiah. Maybe, we do find in the book of Acts, there are sometimes people who are hanging around, it's like somebody who hasn't had internet in years or something. It's like they haven't heard about Jesus. They just know about John the Baptist. It's like, let me bring you up to speed or whatever. And interestingly, when that happens, those people seem to be very easily converted to Christianity. They never seem to be resistant in Acts, but I don't know that we have any evidence that as late. I tend to think John was written in the old age of the author. That seems to be a patristic view, that late there were still people around saying that John the Baptist was the Messiah. It's possible, but probably our only evidence for it is that passage occurs in John, but maybe that passage just occurs in John because it happened and John thought it was interesting. So
Right.
that may be all there is to it.
But even imagining that is true, it's not a literary device to highlight what you think is an important detail
Right.
that the author thinks is historical.
Right.
He's picking particular details because of his context.
Right.
But he cares about those details because he thinks they're true. He's not necessarily inventing dialogues of John the Baptist.
Right.
He could be highlighting and remembering particularly things that John the Baptist said that he thinks are most relevant to keep people from converting to John the Baptistism, even if that's a risk in his environment. That's not a literary device. That's still compatible with historical reportage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what you're saying about why the Gospel of John could be different than the Synoptics, is having a different context, having different motivations, having different goals and worries and concerns is entirely compatible with a historical reportage. It just affects what you report, what you emphasize, what you don't emphasize, etc.
Right. And that actually kind of takes us to the Christology issue. I mean, what you just said. Bart Ehrman is real big on the argument from silence. It's one of his favorites. And so he'll say, well, surely if Jesus had really said, I and the Father are one, the synoptics would have reported it. Why would they not have reported this big thing and so forth? And so I think to some extent we have this anachronistic view that the synoptic authors were thinking to themselves, what's the strongest thing that Jesus ever said that sounded like he was claiming to be God? I want to be sure to get that in there. Maybe that wasn't what was in their minds that they thought they needed to highlight. Maybe they were trying to talk about him being the Messiah more instead. And then, John, you can even picture John. Hey, why didn't they mention that? I got to be sure to mention that, or even the foot washing. Why didn't they mention the foot washing? I want to tell about that. So the argument from silence, and this is a probabilistic issue as well, Tim has written an article on this, depends heavily on the idea that if something were true, we would have expected to find this person mentioning it. And therefore, the fact that he didn't mention it is strong evidence that it's not true.
Well, as someone who's a little bit of a fan of the argument from silence, especially related to Christological questions, there is some probabilistic weight of what you can do when things aren't mentioned, right? And especially the more data you have, the longer you go without seeing something, the less likely you'll ever see the something, right?
Well, it depends on what the something is. So I like to make the following contrast. I don't see a spider in this room. Therefore, probably there's not a spider in this room. contrasted with, I don't see a tiger in this room, therefore probably there is not a tiger in this room.
Fair
Okay.
enough.
Obviously, the second is a much stronger argument. That spider, he could live out his entire life in that corner down there and live and die and eat flies, and I would never see him. So that's where we need to calibrate. In fact, Tim has some amazing examples of people who don't mention things you would think they would mention. Ulysses S. Grant having memoirs and not mentioning the Emancipation Proclamation, for example. Marco Polo never mentioning the Great Wall of China, all these things, it's quite a number of them that you'd really be surprised that people don't mention. So arguments from silence come in many different flavors. And I think the worst argument from silence, the worst way to do it is to take the silence of one person and to pit it off or square it off against the definite assertion by another person whom you have some reason to believe is reliable.
Mm-hmm.
So suppose my husband and daughter, suppose they both drive home the same way most days, all right? And so one day they both come home and my daughter says there was this terrible accident and she names the intersection. And then Tim comes home and he just talks to me about other things. He doesn't say anything about the accident. And I kind of would expect him to come the same way. Now, how good of an argument? I mean, does that mean that I think she made up the accident?
Mm-hmm.
Even if like he never mentions, like months pass and he never mentions the accident, well, so what? It's not even like it gets all that much stronger as the months pass. So it's not good for me to say she probably made up the accident because he didn't mention it, and to try to pit them against one another because they're not
Yeah.
equal in weight at all. There could be all kinds of reasons why he didn't mention the accident.
But also, like you said, with the spider versus tiger example, the more important or salient a point is, the more noticeable its silence is also.
But we do need to say salient to whom?
That's a good point.
Okay, to
And that's a
us
very good point.
versus the person we're concerned about. And that's kind of what I was bringing up about the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, we're really interested. We think of that as like the most important thing that Abraham Lincoln did.
Yeah.
Maybe Ulysses S. Grant didn't agree with us.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's in history especially, it's astonishing how saliency varies. In
Yeah.
fact, I've often said we need to get a new grasp on what I call the randomness of saliency.
Fair
It
enough.
is astonishing how random saliency is and varies from one person to another.
Amen. that is very true. So I guess transitioning a little bit more to talk about Christology
Sure.
itself. So Bart Ehrman, as you know, and perhaps maybe people who are listening to this video who were followed here by Dr. McGrew, but don't know me very well or don't know where I'm coming from. I guess I should just give a little disclaimer, is that I come from a non-Trinitarian form of Christianity. We call ourselves biblical Unitarians. We believe just in basically a human Messiah, Jesus, who didn't pre-exist his birth or anything like that, and that God the Father is all of who God is, and God is unipersonal. Just to put it briefly. So I didn't want to, speaking of what's salient,
Sure.
I could imagine some of your audience following here and not knowing that. So that is an important context
I'm
that
going to
could be.
announce it.
Yes, no, that's totally fine. Please
Yeah.
do. So in general, I'm considered outside the realm of orthodoxy. I'm not a Jehovah's Witness, not a Mormon. It's different than those two things. But so biblical Unitarians are a little bit lukewarm on Bart Ehrman about Christology in general, because we sort of like him because it's like, well, he points out that the Trinity is not in the Bible and that Jesus being God and all these things is a subject that progressed over time in a way that a lot of Christians don't realize. But for people who are like really nitty gritty about Christology stuff, Bart Ehrman actually isn't that good. In general, you can probably, you won't take any gumption with me saying that. So that there's a lot of resolution on the topic of Christology that Bart Ehrman doesn't really seem to understand. So a big thing that a lot of secular scholars will do will be like, the synoptic gospels have a human Jesus who is not a deity in some sort of pre-existent sense. You know, he's really close to God and uniquely divine, maybe, but not like divine in the full capital D sense. And then the Gospel of John has an obviously divine deity, deified Jesus, and these two are just in contrast with each other. And this is something that developed in the decades between them, or something like that. And so this is where there's probably an interesting parallel and contrast between us, in that we will assert that the Gospels are portraying the same Jesus, they're portraying the same Christology, but we disagree about what exactly that
Yes.
Christology is. And so I don't know, I guess, do you have any reactions, I guess, before I keep monologuing on that?
Well, no, I mean, I think that's a clear statement, of where we're each coming from. I'm a little interested in the fact, because I didn't know this before you started sending me, your questions and so forth, that you don't, in a sense, take a more Ehrman-esque position about John. Like, I might have thought that you would take the position that the material that's in John, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, or whatever, is not historical. What I've gathered from your questions and your self-presentation is that you actually think that is historical, but that it's been misunderstood by Trinitarians. Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And so then I'm just guessing, this is just guessing, you didn't tell me
Yeah,
this, but
sure.
I'm just guessing that you think that Jesus is just claiming to be the Messiah there, or something like that.
Yes, so in John 8:58 in particular, and man, do I get asked about this passage a lot.
Sure, of course, and
Yes,
10:30 as well,
yes. And so when Jesus said, so in that dialogue, right, he's having, it's one of those, it's perhaps the most heated debate dialogue in the whole Gospels, where both of
Yes.
them put very slanderous things against each other. And so the point, basically why I understand the point of the dialogue is that Jesus is saying that to now be a child of God, you have to be a child of God through Jesus, through faith in Jesus. Like in the Old Testament, you were a literal child of God by being a descendant of Abraham, but now there's this new religious spiritual sense in that we're children of God through Jesus. And that's the idea that Jesus is trying to get across in this passage. And so the Jews are like, oh, how dare you say that we're illegitimate children, or how dare you say that we're children of Satan, we're children of Abraham, and that's how we are right with God. And Jesus says, no, you do the works, you don't do the works of Abraham, you do the works of Satan, or whatever. And then so then they say, well, who are you? Do you think that you're more important than Abraham? And that's one of many such questions in the Gospel of John. Who do you think you are? Who are you saying that you are? Are you, the Samaritan woman asked him, are you more important than our father Jacob who built this well? Right? That's a common question in the Gospel of John. Who
I
do you
think
say that you
Jesus
are?
invited it. I think he had a
Right.
manner that invited it.
And John was salient to pick out those particular stories because that's also the point of his gospel.
And then now I'm trying to remember here, my memory is failing me, though. Isn't it in Matthew where Jesus turns it around and says, who do men say that I am? And who do
Yes.
you say that I am? So
Yes.
he's asking that question too. So anyway, go
Although
ahead.
seemingly in a moment of sort of honesty and vulnerability with his disciples in a certain sense, right? When he asked the question. But in this heated debate with
Yeah.
about being children of God, or children of Abraham, or children of God through the one true Son, Jesus said, who do you say that, are you more important than Abraham? And he says, Abraham looked forward to seeing my day. He saw it and was glad.
Right.
And they're like, what? You're not even 50 years old. And you think that you saw Abraham. And then he says, assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, ego eimi. And I'm pretty sure that you know your Greek well enough that ego eimi is like, I am, or I am he, or it's me, right?
You can translate it that way. I think when Jesus walks on the water, he says, fear not, it is I. I think he's just saying, hey guys, chill.
A self-identity statement,
Right,
right?
chill. It's me, it's not a ghost or whatever. That's
And
dynamic equivalent.
and 10 verses later, the blind man, right? The Pharisees are looking around, where's the blind man? Where's the guy who was healed, who was born blind, who's been healed? And the guy says, ego eimi, right? Exact same
We
Greek.
would say it, I am he.
Or it's me, or I'm the one, or
It is
I'm that
I.
guy. Yeah.
Mhm.
Like my mom like taught me, when you answer the phone and someone asks for you, you say, this is he, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's self-identity is a weird grammatical construction. But so what I think that Jesus is doing is that he's just reiterating his self-identity as the one that Abraham looked forward to, as opposed to invoking the divine name.
But the
Now,
before Abraham was part?
that is an interesting question. So one thing that I think is interesting is that this argument that Jesus is invoking the divine name there is not in the church fathers. You can't, I'm not quite sure when this argument originated. I think in the 18th or 19th century, but you don't find any of the church fathers, even the Greek speaking ones, making the argument from divine name identity. But a lot of them will use this passage to talk about whether or not Jesus pre-existed in some sense, Arian
Which you
or
don't believe
Trinitarian.
either.
So I don't believe that either. So I think that in a weird sort of way, the passage is already kind of a little bit weird in time, in that Abraham looked forward to Jesus's day, right? Past tense. Abraham saw it and was glad. So in what sense did Abraham see Jesus's day? In some sort of like prophetic future, right? Like, how did Abraham see the day of the Messiah? Some sort of
Mhm.
prophetic revelation or something like that? And that it's like Jesus is saying that even back then, I was in a sense Abraham's Messiah, in this sort of weird dischronological prophetic future sense.
Yeah,
I
but he
admit,
says before. He doesn't even say when Abraham was.
so I hear what you're saying, but I
I'm
will
pushing
also,
you. I'm
I
pushing
know,
you.
I think that's fine. So I think that I will say that a lot of people Mott and Bailey me this on this one, where they start out with divine name and then switch to pre-existence, which I think the pre-existence is actually a much easier thing to make. I will say that this is one of the passages that I think I can mostly explain, but it's a little bit different, and maybe we're not fully understanding what Jesus says.
Well, you know what's going to happen next? You're going to become an Aryan.
Yeah, well, fair enough.
Because they believed in pre-existence, but not in divinity.
And honestly, so what I would say about the Gospel of John is
I'm
that,
not recommending that, by the way.
fair enough. Well, what I'm about to say might give you more goosebumps. I think that the if you were to say which of the Christologies fit the Gospel of John best, I would say that Arianism probably does. And so one thing that makes me think that Arianism fits the Gospel of John best, or at least some form of subordinationism, is that Jesus constantly in the Gospel of John is talking about he's derived everything from the Father,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
right? He's derived his authority from the Father, his ability to judge from the Father,
Sure.
his teachings from the Father, his actions
Mm-hmm.
from the Father, his works from the Father. The Father's
Mm-hmm.
greater than me,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. And Jesus says, this is eternal life, that you may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you've sent.
Yeah,
Seemingly,
Dale Tuggy loves that one.
yeah, well, Dale Tuggy does love that one. And honestly, so what keeps me from being an Arian is the other books of the New Testament. And this is where my argument that if we assume that the Gospels are portraying the same Jesus, that it seems like the other ones, I would say if I had to like give something like probability weights to like say a Trinitarian Christology, an Arian Christology, and a biblical Unitarian Christology, I would, for just the Gospel of John alone, I would say that Arianism might win with like 50 or 60% of the vote, and that biblical Unitarianism and Trinitarianism might split the last piece of the pie. But that, like, if you like look at the book of Acts and you did that same thing, well, then like biblical Unitarianism steals the cake. And that if you look at the rest of the books together, I think that's what yields the understanding of a better biblical Unitarian interpretation of John.
It's interesting. You know, the book of Acts is not, in my opinion, heavily theological.
Fair enough.
I don't think there's anything in it that contradicts any other theology, but it, there's a there's a book by a guy named Green Armitage about John, and I actually am dedicating my coming book to him. But he also has one about Luke. It's not quite as amazing and great. It's the one about John, but it's also pretty good. I went ahead and I bought it, used. And one of the interesting things he says is he doesn't think Luke was as interested in theology as Paul was. And that in a sense they're working together. It's Luke is the practical man and Paul is the theologian.
Hmm.
And one of the ways that I know we're getting off topic, but I
No,
think you
that's
can tell
fine.
this is that in Acts he never mentions the epistles. If he was really accompanying Paul, he must have known Paul was writing the epistles, but he doesn't even seem to have read them. I mean, this is what gives rise to some of the alleged contradictions between Acts and the epistles. There's very strong independence there, actually, but he knows what Paul is doing. And so
Hmm.
I think that might account in part for what you're seeing there, is that lack of emphasis upon any kind of heavy metaphysics. I don't think
Yeah,
he has a
but like
metaphysical
the
mind.
speeches of Peter and stuff like that are, him going around and preaching the gospel, like, on the Pentecost speech and some of
It's
those
very
other
early, yes.
speeches, right? And so those ones are, relatively theological and are communicating theological ideas. And like when you look at honestly, I think the strongest argument for biblical Unitarianism is the speeches in Acts, which seem to basically just seem like there's God, he sent a human being, it's Jesus Christ, here he is, and now Jesus has been exalted into the heavens with God, right?
Do you think that the Pauline epistles are authentic?
Yes, yes, I would be fine saying, maybe sometimes I wonder about, like, I don't know, Second Timothy or whatever, but I'm fine for the most part saying that the Pauline epistles are authentic.
Because that should certainly inform your understanding of Paul's speeches in Acts.
Right,
That, if Paul doesn't go into Christology, that certainly isn't because he doesn't have it. He just
right.
apparently wasn't going into it very much in those particular
Hmm.
incidents, because we know that Paul has this Christology that he talks about
And
a
and
lot.
another thing that I haven't mentioned that I think honestly affects my reading of John is the book of Revelation. I will assume that the two Johns are the same, that they're the same author
Mhm.
between Revelation and the Gospel. And I think that the first 5 chapters of the book of Revelation are also very theological, very Christologically focused, and very lean heavily in the direction of a human, Jesus Unitarianism exalted into the
Wow.
heavens.
Boy,
I know.
I disagree. I mean, especially because he was a Jew. That's where I really a Jew is really careful about whom he worships. He doesn't fall
Hmm.
down at his feet as one dead. And in Revelation, you even have that contrast where the angel says, "See, you do it not. I am a servant like to yourself." So there's some people you worship, and some, you
Right.
don't worship anybody who's not God.
And I think that one of the weird things about Christianity was exalting a human to a higher and newer place than any human had been exalted. I do think that that was part of what you might say, the Christological innovation or something of the early Christian community. And I think sometimes biblical Unitarians get underestimated for exactly how high of a Christology that we have, because there's really no other way to describe what we think Jesus is now except divine in some sense, depending on how you define divine.
Yeah, I mean, but that ends up then being in very great tension with Judaism, I
Well,
believe.
so I think that the way that well, I mean, Trinitarianism is in way greater tension with Judaism than biblical Unitarianism. But
I
I
don't
would
agree.
say that the antecedent, the story that I point to a lot. So at the end of the book of First Chronicles, right, King David is passing on the throne to Solomon, and like all of the assembly of Israel is gathered, and it says that they bow down and worship God, Yahweh, and the king, and that there's this sense that the king is sort of like underneath and that God is the authority and power behind the throne, and that worship is sort of directed to both of them simultaneously. Like the king is the visible manifestation, but he's not God himself, but there's God sort of above him that's giving him his glory and is the source of his authority and righteousness. And I think that is sort of the antecedent image of the image in Revelation of bowing down before God and the Lamb.
I'd
That
have to read that passage and see if it just means, bowed. If
well,
I would take it
that's
just to
the
mean the physical act,
that's the
which
tricky
has
thing about that word
meaning.
is in Greek and Hebrew, bow down and worship are the same word, right?
Right,
It's
right.
a physical act and a religious act at the same time, and that's part of where this is tricky. And sometimes I think we make a distinction where there actually wasn't one, that bowing down and worshiping was part of that same sort of religious act.
Well, as a Protestant, I mean, in a sense, I understand that because, when people talk about praying to Mary, the hairs on the back of my neck start rising. I'm like, I want to watch that. But I think the Jews, even more than modern Protestants, were pretty careful. And I think, that's part of maybe where we are also going to disagree, that they made that distinction. Going back to John 8:58, why do you think they tried to stone Jesus?
I think that there are multiple explanations. Well, first off, Jesus gets attempted to be stoned in the Gospel of John a couple times,
Correct.
seemingly sometimes for just claiming to be the Son of God, right? That seemed to be a stonable. I think sometimes that we think that part of the argument behind this is that the Jews always did things in the Gospel of John for just reasons. And I think that part of the image is that they weren't always trying to stone him for fair reasons. Like, and so sometimes he gets attempted to be stoned for just saying that he's the Son of God, sometimes seemingly for just claiming to be the Messiah. And
There's
then,
only 2 times in John that they try to stone him.
or what about maybe stoning, but there's also the slipping through the crowds, right? Because the crowd's getting mad at him. I feel like that happens more than just twice.
Nope, just twice in John. You may be confusing it with Luke, where they try to throw him off a hill.
Fair enough. All right. So
In Luke, they
what's
try to
the
throw him off a hill in Nazareth. It's because he sort of insults them by saying it's something about Elijah, um, something about Elijah going to the widow who was not Jewish. It's almost like a racial insult that the Gentiles might have more faith or that kind of thing, and they get really ticked off and they try to throw him off a hill, and he gets away. In John, it's twice, and both of the times are times that a Trinitarian will argue are places where he's made a claim to God. It's the
well,
8:58 and 10:30.
so I will say that in John 10, it does seem that that's what the Jews hear him to say. I'll go back and finish. I will
Yeah,
address
yeah.
your question about John 8. But in John 10, I do think that they misunderstood him as a claim to deity and that he corrects them
Yeah.
afterwards.
Well,
And that's, but
they said you being a man make yourself equal to God. They're like super explicit.
right. And then he seemingly backs it off, right? That's what I think that, well, what does he say in the next dialogue? He says, first off, in the Old Testament, some humans get called gods, right? And then he quotes that verse.
Right, so
And if
82.
those to whom the word of God came can be called, what is it that I'm saying that I'm the Son of God, right? So he's clarifying. Sometimes humans can be called God. I'm not calling myself God. I'm calling myself the Son of God. And I'm doing the works that you see me doing from the Father, right?
I
And
don't view that as backing it off, but I mean, he does say, him whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world, you know, can he not say, I am the Son of God? Interestingly, though, as you were noting just a moment ago, they will sometimes say, are you I believe are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed, is the question that he's asked in one of the synoptics as to whether he's blaspheming. I would take that to mean that he is, in a sense, invested the phrase Son of God by all the different things he's been doing with a meaning that is offensive to Jewish sensibilities. So I don't actually think they misunderstand him there. I think they do understand him.
I think
Um,
sometimes it's also the claim that it's he that is the Son of God, that they think it's perhaps improper of him because they don't yet believe him, right? I think
yeah,
that,
that
like,
I really disagree with, because blasphemy is a different thing. I was just thinking about this yesterday. I thought this might come up tonight. So suppose somebody told me that Sun Myung Moon was God incarnate, or the incarnate Son of God in the same way that Jesus was, and I'm like, that's really bad, dude. That's blasphemy or whatever. What do I mean by saying it's blasphemy? I don't mean, well, yeah, there could be some other incarnate Son of God, just like Jesus. I just don't happen to think Reverend Moon is. No, if I call it blasphemy, what I'm saying is you're making some kind of category error about the nature of God. It's like nobody else. Jesus is unique. He's the unique son, so it's blasphemy to say that moon is also the son in the same sense. So I think that the Jews, similarly, when they say something's blasphemy, I don't think they just mean, well, somebody someday is going to be what you're saying. We
Well,
just don't
so
happen to think you're it, because then they wouldn't call it blasphemy. They would just say, you're mistaken or something.
So here's what I would say is the problem of going too far in that direction, is then you get a Messiah that was unrecognizable to the Jews. And while to some degree, certainly a crucified Messiah was surprising, upsetting, disappointing, what have you, as opposed to sort of just a politically triumphant Messiah, which might have been the more typical expectation, I don't think there were any Jews that expected the Messiah to be God.
I
And
would agree with
if
you. I agree
and
with you.
and so then if you get yourself in the situation where the Messiah has to be a blasphemer in order to be true, then you've gotten yourself in a very weird situation, right? Do
I
you see
didn't
why
say
I'm
he has
saying
to be
that?
a blasphemer to be true. I just say I think he was God.
Well, so that you're getting yourself into a situation where he will have to be perceived to be a blasphemer in order to be the Messiah. And that seems weird, right? Do you see what I'm saying? Right? Like if you're
Well,
saying that
I
the
wouldn't have
Messiah,
known. I
if
wouldn't have
you're
known he was going to be God either. I mean, if I were a Jew, I would have had to have learned that, right?
right, and that's why I'm saying is so weird, is that if you think that it turns out that the Messiah is God,
Mm-hmm.
then his own self-identity would only be able to be interpreted as blasphemy. And that just doesn't seem right, that
Well,
God would throw such a weird, almost
curveball,
self-contradictory,
curveball.
curveball. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting question. So let me address it. That wasn't on our list, but actually, I've been thinking a lot about that recently. So,
Okay.
um, I'm not saying that they were right to think that the Messiah wasn't going to be God. I just think they did think that he wasn't going to be God, and it
Fair enough.
wasn't a stupid thing for them to think. I mean, it was
Fair
sort of
enough.
understandable. Now, someone like my friend Jonathan McClatchy, I mean, if he's going to watch this, he's gonna message me. He's going to be like, "Why didn't you say this? Why didn't you say this?"
Oh,
Okay,
we
no, but
always Monday morning quarterback ourselves.
right,
I'm
no,
sure
no,
I'll do that
Jonathan's
too.
great. Jonathan's a great guy. But he's got all of these wonderful things in the Old Testament that, some of them I agree with, some of them I don't agree with, etc., but that are like hints of the Trinity in the Old Testament, hints of the deity of the Messiah in the Old Testament, and so forth. And I think some of those may really be there. Okay, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever, and things like that. Um,
Therefore,
and
God, your God. But anyway.
okay, all right. So there are these hints and glimpses of the deity of the Messiah, but I think God kept it a little bit vague. He kept it because he was trying to teach them monotheism. That was the danger, right? Was polytheism and idolatry and so forth. So he didn't want to teach binitarianism or something, and that's where I disagree with Michael Heiser, who thinks there was a Jewish binitarianism.
No.
Um, but he did drop in these hints that then the new Christians would be able to latch onto and use, and I think they did. Okay, but it was going to be somewhat of a shock, and I think that absolute monotheism had in a sense hardened. By the time you got to the time of Jesus, it was like they had clarified their theology. They were like, no way that the Messiah, he's a man, he's born to a particular woman at a particular time. There's no way that he is going to be God. And of course, God knows everything. He knew that. He knew
Mm-hmm.
that that was how those people at that time were going to respond, most of them. Okay. So what does Jesus do? Well, he performs miracles. He continually asks people, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? He pushes, he takes this incredibly high handed approach to things. I mean, Tom Gilson has just written an interesting book recently, Too Good to Be False, and that's part of what he's emphasizing there, is that the extreme self-confidence that Jesus had, and projected in the way he taught with authority. So he does all of this. He's incredibly egotistical, you could almost say. And this is where C.S. Lewis's liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma, which I'm sure you disagree with, I think works really well, because Jesus...
I just he turns it into a liar, lunatic, or God. I'm fine with liar, lunatic, or Lord.
I see. Right. So, but part of why Jesus would be a lunatic is because he's claiming to be God. I mean, that's what it's like, whoa, then you're a lunatic if you're wrong, right? If you really believe that. So, okay, and he draws them along somewhat gradually. He draws even his own disciples along. In fact, I think sometimes his disciples may not have believed that Jesus was God during his lifetime because they didn't want to accuse him of blasphemy. I think they may have been trying to be charitable, in a sense, to him.
Interesting.
Okay, and that's why they don't understand. And
I would agree that the disciples didn't understand the full significance of Jesus and the full nature of his identity during his lifetime.
I don't think
I'm totally
did.
fine with that.
And then he rises from the dead. And so then at this point, it's like, we've got to accept something new here, something that may have been previously offensive to us. Okay. And of course, then they're kind of working on developing and working out what this is. And this is where I think Peter's speech on Pentecost comes in. He's saying what he knows at that time. That's only 40 days after Jesus rose from the dead. And I think he was inspired by the Holy Ghost. They had, the Holy Ghost had just come. He just came that day, But at the same time, I mean, you got to give him a little time. I'm not going to hold it to be like decades or something. But give him a year, maybe? Can you give him a year to figure this stuff out?
So you would hold to some amount of development in Christology over time, I guess.
But it's like a little
time. A little bit, couple years, but not
maybe a year.
Greater than 40 days.
A little bit, yeah. Greater than 40 days, less than 3 years, or something, yeah.
That is interesting. All right, so
in their minds, but not that it wasn't true. I mean, see, to my mind, Jesus said it clearly enough. See, I really do think he was invoking the divine name.
And
but
you
I think
John 8:58 is really your nail it down. That's interesting. So, I mean,
but we do that with our friends all the time, don't we? He can't really have meant that.
Well,
like if you love somebody and he says something that on social media that sounds outrageous, All
right, so let's go back to John 58. I feel like, or 8:58, excuse me. I think you actually pointed me in a question that I never circled back to.
Okay, go ahead.
Some others, so like John 8, I looked it up now. All right, John 8:42. Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God, and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand?" That's not what I was looking for. I was backing up to verse 40. "But now you seek to kill me, a man who is," so they're killing him, even trying to kill him even before he says the before Abraham was. "But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God." Like Jesus in that sentence says, I'm a man, I'm an anthropos, who heard truth from God. And in the whole dialogue, God and the Father are just interchangeable. And that if God were your father, right, he's identifying their God, the monotheistic God of the Jews, with his Father. And it's just a one-to-one equivalence, right? You can, in the whole dialogue, if you were to swap the Father for God, or God the Father for God, or the Father for God, right? They're completely interchangeable words that suggest that they have the same meaning in the context. So the monotheistic God of the Jews is just God's Father, or Jesus's Father, excuse me. And then
he was a man. I mean, Trinitarians do believe he was a man.
I know, but it is interesting that he identifies himself as a man sent from God. Like he doesn't even say God the Father. He just says God, as if God is a completely separate character. And they're not even arguing over the identity of God. They're arguing over what does it mean to be a child of God? Does it mean to be a child of Abraham or adopted through the Son? And even that argument doesn't work if Jesus just is God. I feel like the whole thrust of the passage loses its narrative oomph if Jesus just is God in some, tri-personal sense. Or, well, not that Jesus is tri-personal, but you know what I mean.
No. Well, so first of all, he's trying to accuse them of being bad, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
it's pretty clear. All right.
Yes.
Now, and I don't know that every person in that crowd is seeking to kill him. And they even challenge him on that. They're like, "Who's seeking to kill you? What are you talking about?" But the leaders are trying to kill him, and he
Yeah.
knows that, and that's jealousy and envy and all their other rationalizations that they're using and whatnot. And some
Sure.
of the people there may be in cahoots with them, right?
Sure.
All right. So from their perspective, at least, he is a man sent from God, right? He's at
Yes.
least a prophet. He's at least a good man. They say he went about doing good and so forth. And he's like, that is the work of the devil. Like we would say, y'all are evil, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what we would say. So I think at this point in the conversation, he hasn't yet gotten to his before Abraham was I am statement. He's
Sure.
making a particular type of argument to the effect that this is really bad. Somebody who is a prophet sent from God, you shouldn't be trying to kill. And you find Jesus doing that. Which of the prophets have you not killed? He says that's in the
Yes.
synoptics,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yep. That's also a good correspondence. But yes, continue.
He'll say, it cannot be, I must travel on today and tomorrow, for it cannot be that a prophet would die outside of Jerusalem. Just this bitter statement that he makes. And so from their perspective, he is at least a prophet. And I would say Jesus was a prophet, but not a merely, he was also God incarnate, So I think that's just his way of trying to show the evil of attempting to kill him. Now, as
Well,
far as
but part of it is the child metaphor, right? They're saying we're child of Abraham, and Abraham is therefore a connection to God. And then Jesus saying, no, you're actually children of your father, Satan, right? So there's
right,
this father-child
right.
relationship. And then he's like inserting himself and trying to explain, no, to really be a child of God, you have to come through the Son, who is me, and I'm, the true son in the house, and that's why I can set the slaves free so that they can become real members of the household. And there's sort of that Greco-Roman
If
era,
the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed. Right.
Right. And it's like that same sort of connection where, God, Abraham children, God, Jesus children, as opposed to being Satan children. Right. And the metaphor just seems to break down and lose one of its links in the chain if Jesus just sort of is that God.
Well,
And I
I
know
mean,
that even within
obviously
the Trinity, he's the
it's
son
a
of the
it's a
Father.
mystery, right? I mean, nobody. I'm not going
Yeah.
to claim to sit here and explain the Trinity to you in words
Well,
of one syllable, but he. Okay, so he isn't the Father; he's the Son,
well,
right?
that I will agree with.
Trinitarian doctrine is that the Father is not the Son, but both the Father and the Son are God. I mean, that just is Trinitarian doctrine. And so he's bringing them into this relationship with him in terms that, I mean, you're going to have to explain it in terms that are understandable as far as the human mind is able to understand it. Now, God, the body of Jesus was made out of atoms, in that sense. In the incarnation, he was a creature, okay, and he had a human soul and so forth, presumably, so he was in that sense a creature, but he was also the creator. He was also God. So his ultimate total being was not Trinitarian doctrine derived from God in the sense of being created. He was not a created being in that sense, but qua incarnate, that was created. Okay, so you've got all these different things playing around, and he's not trying to explain all of that to them. He can only barely begin, right? He can only barely begin to explain all of that to them.
Right. Well,
And
and
he's
I
going to
do
do that
think
with that shocking statement, before Abraham was I am.
so. So, all right. Two things. One, this might be too big of a tangent to maybe I should skip, but earlier in our conversation, we talked about simple and complex models, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that all things equal, a simple model is to be preferred over a complex
Mm-hmm.
model.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this is an argument that I've tried to communicate before, but Trinitarians often don't hear me because they perhaps don't know statistics well enough, but you do.
Mm-hmm.
And that I feel that there's something of that argument to be made here, that biblical Unitarianism is a very simple model. It really doesn't have very many moving parts. There's one God, it's just the same God it always was. Jesus is a man, there's no two natures, there's no three hypostases and one ousia or any of these sorts
Mm-hmm.
of things. One divine hypostasis, one ousia, one human being, one nature. And that if it can make sense of the data even approximately as well as a more complex model that allows there to be a human being and a human soul and a human hypostasis, but there's also this divine hypostasis and there's this person, it's like, well, obviously a complex model like that could be made to fit any all sorts of data, but it has the cost of its complexity to it.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you there, but I think that it doesn't fit the data approximately as well. And I really do lean on the fact that Jesus' first followers were all Jews, and that
Yes.
they're not going to worship somebody. I mean, worship.
I'm fine with you. I understand the distinction. I'm fine and agree with you that the earliest Christians worshiped Jesus. And I will even say that I worship Jesus in that sense, and that was a little bit startling to the Jews. I'm willing to go some amount of direction with you in that was something that would have caused some Jews discomfort, but obviously not enough discomfort to prevent it from happening and sort of springing forth in the early Christian circles.
Yeah,
Whereas
see,
and
actually,
I think like you can get that out of the Acts speech. How about, so at the Pentecost speech, I think that you can get the idea of Jesus as someone now worthy of worship, even in the earliest, absolute earliest of Christologies.
it's quite high, but and worthy of, but he doesn't say, he says, neither is there salvation in any other, there's none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. And we're moving there fast. That's why any development that I'm going to have, it's going to be short. It's going to be a very short time period in the mind of, let's say, Peter as an individual. And other
Mm-hmm.
people may have moved faster. John may have already been there, at this point.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a speech from him on the day of Pentecost, but I actually would I would go so far as to say that if you worship somebody and he's a man, you're committing idolatry. I mean, he's just a man. I mean, that's bad.
Well, so
I
I
mean,
hear
so
what you're saying.
that's like why we have to get this
I hear
right.
what you're
And
saying.
I
And
think
then
actually
there's,
the apostles would have agreed with me, and so that's part of why I'm a Trinitarian.
so that's where I would point again to Revelation chapters 4 and 5, which I think are incredibly important for this. So just like brief synopsis, after the letters to the seven churches, then John goes in and he sees the throne room scene,
Mm-hmm.
and there's God on the throne, right? And there's all the gemstones and thunder and
Mm-hmm.
lightning and rainbows and stuff. And there's the four beasts, and then there's all the elders, right? And they're worshiping and they're saying holy, holy, holy,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah,
Right? And seemingly Jesus isn't there. I think that one God is just God the Father, because in chapter 5, then they say, oh, there's the scroll that can't be opened, and then they
right.
say,
Who is
wait a
worthy?
minute, no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth, which is pretty exhaustive, was found who is worthy to open the scroll. So it's like, so where's Jesus at that point in time? And then it says, behold, the
The
root
Lamb.
of the Lion of Judah,
Mm-hmm.
the root of Jesse has triumphed.
Right.
And then Jesus, now as a lamb that was slain, seemingly in his own blood, now exalted into the throne room of heaven, is then brought onto the throne at the right hand inside the circle of the elders and the circle of the beasts. And then they bow down again and they sing a new song, and they
Worthy is the
sing,
Lamb that was slain to
we're
receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing.
right, because you purchased for your God the nation and the tribes and the et cetera, et cetera. I'm paraphrasing. And then they worship God and the Lamb, seemingly together, the beasts and the elders, etc. So there is this like this regime altering thing that requires a new song to be sung in heaven, and the Lamb isn't worshipped because he is God himself. He's worshipped because of what he accomplished for God. And
Well,
that's,
those are hardly mutually exclusive. I mean,
well, but it does say your God. Like that just doesn't seem to me like you would say something about the heavenly exalted Jesus if he is God. Gods
I would
don't
have
have a
to check
God.
the
Fair
Greek
enough.
text on that, you know. But your my God and your God actually occurs in Jesus' words to Mary Magdalene. I
Yeah.
ascend to my
My
Father and
God
your
and your,
Father, my God and your God. So, um, has redeemed us to God by his blood is the King James. I'd have to check the, you know,
sure.
but we do have another instance that I just handed you of Jesus referring to my God. The interesting
Yeah.
thing there, as Tom has noted, is that he distinguishes the sense in which he's his God from the sense in which he's her God, which I find interesting right there. The sense in which he's his father from her father. He doesn't say our Father. Notice that he never says our Father except when he's teaching them to pray. He says, when
Mm-hmm.
you pray, pray our Father. Jesus calls God Father when he speaks to him. And then there's this one place where he says, my Father and your Father. It is an interesting, I wouldn't want to lean too much on it, but it is an interesting distinction that he
No,
makes.
and I actually agree with you. I think that it's sort of like there is a sense in which until Jesus's mission is accomplished, only Jesus is the rightful son, right? And it's similar to that John 8 passage where Jesus, being the only begotten Son of God, is uniquely in the household family of God until he can sort of liberate and join to himself all of the captives whom he sets free.
Do you
So
also, I mean, this is taking us kind of afield, but do you also try to reinterpret similarly all of the Pauline Christology as well?
well, honestly, I think the Pauline Christology is really easy. I think that one
Oh
leans
my
very
gosh.
heavily in favor of Unitarianism. And
Oh,
I know,
okay,
but
let's not go there. Let's not go there. All right.
I have a whole other video where I debated Chris Date about Philippians
I
2
didn't
almost the
watch
whole
it, but I
time.
saw that. I mean, yeah,
You know,
given him a name that is above every name. So, I mean, when we get into all of that, that's
given
where
though, given,
the name, a Jew says
yeah,
the name. What does a Jew
right. And
mean? The
so
name.
honestly, I think that's part of what's going on is that they think, like, imagine that there's a father there's a guy who's in charge of a corporation, right? And there's this hierarchy underneath him, right? And there's some rebellious part of the company that's like trying to usurp him or something like that. And this guy is like the president and CEO of the company, and then his son suddenly, I don't know, finishes business school, and then he promotes his son to president of the company or something like that, and says, now all of you people have to submit, and some part of the company
I'm
doesn't want to submit.
retiring.
I'm
Yeah.
retiring, or whatever. And so he's giving his son, who has his same last name, right, his names and titles, such that the reverence that was previously due to him alone is now due to him and his son, right? He's including him in the C-suite for the first time or something. I think something like that is, in a royal, heavenly sense, is the metaphor that is being communicated there in Philippians 2 and Revelation and other places. And
That
and
would make Christianity so formally incompatible with the Old Testament that I think you'd have a major problem, because God, as he presents himself, never can communicate. I mean, it's a metaphysical matter as to whom you should give that kind of all encompassing, give yourself to this person, all, your whole life, give your whole life to this person and so forth, worship in that sense. To do that to anyone who is not God is idolatry. And that's a consistent biblical teaching. And in a sense, the simplicity of Trinitarianism consists in the fact that it's consistent on that point. That you may not worship, to use our phrase, anyone but God.
yeah,
God
I
alone, and
mean,
him only shalt thou worship. you know?
I've talked with a decent number of Jews, and they often tend to find my Christology way less blasphemous than the Trinitarian version, even if they do tend to disagree with me on some points. Like, I think that you either need to redefine worship or you need to redefine God. And that I think from the original Jewish setting, because I think you would agree with me, I think you've already said this, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, that Old Testament Jews and even the Jews in Jesus' time were not Trinitarians, nor were they expecting to be. And so you say that Christianity introduces a surprise in the Godhead. And I'm saying that Christianity didn't introduce a surprise in the Godhead. Godhead's still the same guy, but it introduces a surprise in the heavenly hierarchy and the worship by which we give to God. And I think that God is able to exalt a person, a human being, his own special son, to that place. And that is, in fact, the ultimate thing that needs to be recognized, or now you are no longer on God's side. You're like part of that rebellious part of the company hierarchy that's still not recognizing the promotion of the son to the presidency or
Then might
something.
he do that with you?
Well, I am not the only begotten son.
Yeah,
So
well,
there
why
is,
was there only one? I mean,
but it makes that I don't know. Um, but you know, like the Gospel of John, like I heard you talk about this in one of the videos that I was listening to either yesterday or something recently, that there are a lot of things in the Gospel of John where God gives something to Jesus and then Jesus gives it to everybody, right? You know, like you were referencing, you know, John 10, where Jesus says, I and the Father are one. But in the high priestly prayer, he prays that his followers would be one with him, just as, or one with God, just as he is, right? There's this oneness of God, which Jesus already had during his lifetime, which he now wants to bequeath to his followers. He prays that they will be glorified with the glory that you've been given me, right? We get to be sons because he's sons, right? There's all of these things that God gives something to Jesus, and then Jesus bequeaths it to the rest of his Christians, like the Holy Spirit,
sure, I
being
agree with
another perfectly good example. That metaphor seems to be just over and over again in the Gospel of John, and to me, it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't have the full oomph from the Trinitarian perspective, where it's like, well, it's kind of like the Father gave it the Son, but God always had it. It's like, uh,
Well, the Son is incarnate. I mean, we do have to take the incarnation very seriously there. That's not happening like from up in heaven, right? That's happening is after he's already on earth that that he starts talking. He's talking that way. We don't find that with respect to the Son, if I can put it this way, aside from the incarnation. So I think
hmm.
it makes more sense under those circumstances because he's actually walking on earth. He's actually walking with them and walking with us. And it's in that context that he's able to give those things to us.
And it's like, I'm close to being able to agree with that, if depending on what you mean by incarnation, I guess. And
Well,
that's
right. I mean, in a sense, you don't believe in the incarnation,
well,
right?
I believe in the incarnation, like Jesus being the final coming of something that had been prophesied, or like, like prophecy coming to fulfillment, or God's plan coming into action, or something like that. Like in
Yeah,
that
that's a
sort of
totally different
sense.
meaning.
Right. Well,
It's a
fair
very,
enough.
very different meaning. I do want to just be very clear, though, when I say that I don't think the Jews of the Old Testament were Trinitarians, I don't mean that the Old Testament contradicts the New. I think that the Old Testament is a very rich document, and I think it's got this language that you can, in places, take to be a hint or a foreshadowing of the Trinity or of the coming of the Son, the exalted Son, or that kind of thing. But I just don't think that's how they took it. So, I'm not trying to say the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament are different, or New Testament contradicts the Old Testament, or something, simplistic like that. I just think they didn't fully understand it. Maybe Abraham understood it when he went to heaven. In fact, I think he did. And I know this is an unusual interpretation, but when Jesus says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day, he saw it and was glad. I tend to think he's referring to Abraham in heaven.
Hmm.
I tend to think he's referring to, like, when Abraham was in heaven, he came to understand about the Trinity, and he came to understand about, that God's plan for salvation and how his descendant was going to save people from their sins and all that. And he was just absolutely thrilled because he had all this enlightenment, because he's gone to heaven. Inside, I mean, he hadn't been resurrected yet, but his soul went to heaven, and that he really had Jesus, the son really had seen Abraham, and that's why when they say, how have you seen Abraham? And he's like, oh man, I've been around all along, and that when he says, before Abraham was, I am, among other things, he is referring to that pre-existence that enabled Abraham to rejoice to see his day. I
I've
believe
actually
that's a
never heard
minority
that.
interpretation.
I've never heard that before. Yeah, even most Trinitarians, I think that that's some sort of prophetic future reference. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, I could get into my theology of where I think dead people are and where Abraham is, but that
Right, right, right.
we don't have
Okay,
enough.
well, we should probably be
We should probably
moving
be
on
wrapping
here.
up. Yeah. So, yeah, I see what you're saying, and this John 8:58 thing, man, this will always be with me, I guess. I
Oh,
just,
good.
I mean, I really am trying to wrestle with this.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't have conversations with people like you just, to pat myself on the back. I do to be poked and challenged, and I appreciate that. I still, I guess my question is that it doesn't even seem to make sense grammatically in the sentence if it's just invoking the divine name. It doesn't really seem to be making a coherent point in the flow of the story. If Jesus is, the last thing he said, Abraham looked forward to my day, he saw it and was glad. And they're like, you're not 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? Before Abraham was, boom, God name. It's like, I don't, it doesn't even seem to have like a grammatical flow to it.
Huh.
But if he's saying, I am he, and right, and other places in the gospel, he uses ego me, I am he, to identify himself as the Messiah. Sometimes, like on the boat, he identifies it as himself. When he's talking to the Samaritan woman, I who am speaking to you, I am he,
Because she
right?
just said, when the Messiah comes.
When the Messiah comes. And then he says, I think even in the Greek, it's ego a me first. I am he, me speaking to you, or
I who speak to you. Yeah.
yeah. And so it's previously, that same grammatical phrase has been used in the Gospels as a self-identity as the Messiah. I think that's just what he's doing, and I don't quite see how the before Abraham was God name even flows. And so maybe if you
Okay.
could help clarify that.
Yeah. So I do want to back up to the one on the boat. I don't think he's identifying himself as the Messiah there. I
No,
think
right,
he's
I
just
agree.
identifying himself as their friend,
Yes,
and not a
yes,
scary ghost, So anyway,
yes.
all right. But I think it's related to what I just said, that they say he can't have been pre-existent, or he can't have been, he can't have seen Abraham. Like, it doesn't make sense. They're, taking him very literally, and they're,
Yes.
they're like people on Facebook, I mean, they're just like really, really mad,
Yeah.
and like, how in the world can you have seen Abraham? Give me a break, you're a devil-possessed Samaritan, blah, blah, blah. And so he's saying, oh, I'm definitely pre-existent. In fact, I'm so much more than pre-existent. I'm actually God. So in other words, of course I could have known Abraham. There's no problem whatsoever with me having seen or known. They said, have you seen Abraham? I think that's what they say. You're not yet 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? It's like, darn tootin'. Of course I have seen Abraham. I've been around all along, and I know you were talking about Mott and Baileying with pre-existence and deity. Well, I think it's like an a fortiori. So much the more, a
I don't.
fortiori, which means so much the more.
Okay.
Okay, not only am I pre-existent, so much the more I am Yahweh.
Okay.
So that's how I have seen Abraham. That's how there is absolutely no problem with my having seen and known Abraham.
Okay. So here's what I would say is a problem with that. I mean, Abraham knew God, right? I don't think we would deny that Abraham knew God. Abraham spoke with God. Abraham bargained with God for the lives of the Sodomites,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a word that probably I shouldn't say on YouTube,
Ah,
but
whatever,
I
whatever.
said it in the very literal sense.
The inhabitants.
The inhabitants of Sodom, right? Right. So Abraham knew God. Abraham didn't look forward to God's day, right? Abraham didn't look forward to Yahweh's day or something like that. He already knew God. He's looking forward to the Messiah's day. And that's why it would make sense for Jesus to then self-identify as the Messiah. Because you see what I'm saying?
But this way, it actually explains uh, the pre-existence aspect before Abraham was. Of course, he looked forward to him. I mean, as you know, the Trinitarian theory, the Orthodox Christian theory, is that the Son eternally is, but that Jesus was a man born at a particular time, and that's the mystery of the incarnation. The eternal Son became a man at a particular time. So Abraham looks forward to the coming of the Messiah, who also is God. On earth, Abraham didn't know that, of course. All Abraham knew was God told him, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Your seed will be, et cetera, right?
Right,
So he
right.
looks forward to some kind of great blessing that his seed is going to bring to
Right. And
to
the
the
book of
nation.
Hebrews expands on that, and by faith
Right.
he,
And then
you
there
know.
was, I believe, some kind of rabbinic idea that God actually gave him some kind of, vision or something, but that's not actually recorded in. So if we just stick with what's in the Bible, he has this general idea that in him all the families of the earth will be blessed. Then, right, he goes to heaven, and I would theorize, this is speculative, but I would speculate that in heaven a lot more he does come to understand, a lot more we hope to understand, a lot more when we get to heaven, and to understand things we didn't understand before, and understands that it's this actual person who's going to be born, who's going to die for sin and all this great stuff that he's going to do, and I would say understands that he's God. But regardless of whether he understands that he's God, he understands that he's going to come. He hasn't been born yet. And that's true in humans are in time. We humans have to be in time. So he has to look forward to the Messiah, to Jesus as the Messiah. So that explains that part of it. But then how could Jesus himself have seen Abraham? How could Jesus himself have ever literally known Abraham except by reading
Although
about?
Jesus never says that he saw Abraham.
No, he
It,
says, but they say,
they
have
say,
you
but
seen,
yes.
how have you seen Abraham?
But
He says,
he
truly
doesn't,
I say to you, before Abraham was. So he doesn't say, oh, I never saw Abraham, but he foresaw me or whatever. No, he doesn't correct that at all.
mhm.
And I think at that point he's addressing that he himself is pre-existent, and more than pre-existent. He is in fact God. And so he comes out and just and hits that as the way of explaining how he, a man not yet 50 years old, could have known Abraham and been in any sense acquainted with Abraham more than they were.
Sure. And so I could see that compatible also with some form, with an Arian, like if you took the divine name out of it, or even Arians might be okay with him invoking the divine name, depends on the Arian. But you could imagine, Jesus pre-existing, like sort of in the dugout waiting to show up or something like
That's
that.
what they're going to think, but I think
Yeah.
they're going to have a heck of a
Although
time with the
actually
divine name.
most Arians thought that the God that the Old Testament people interacted with was actually the Son, and that God was in some sense God the Father was like above that. So they would have said that Jesus
Interesting.
was the one that Abraham actually interacted with. But,
Interesting. They're
but
going
a
to
lot
have,
of people don't know that about Arians. A
yeah,
lot of people.
I had run into that in Milton. Milton is the Aryan I'm the most well acquainted with from my
Although he might be a weird,
Christian literature.
I'm talking like second, third, fourth century Aryans.
Ah, okay, yeah.
I'm not an expert on Milton. Although he sometimes Unitarians claim him. Although sometimes Unitarian means non-pre-existence or pre-existence. Anyway,
Yeah,
so
he believed in pre-existence for sure. I think they're going to definitely have a hard time with the divine name. I really
so
do.
so about the divine name. So in the Septuagint, the divine name when God's talking to Abraham in the bush is longer than just ego ami. It's like ego ami ho on, or something like that. I am the one who is, or I am the being or the
I
living,
am
or
that I am. I am that I am.
right. So the divine name is longer than just I am, right? And when like the blind man in the next chapter identifies himself as the blind man or the healed blind man that everyone's looking for, when he says ego I me, it's not like, well, you just committed blasphemy.
Well, no, of
It's like
course
a
not. But
perfectly normal Greek phrase. So
yeah,
that's
but
why I
there's a
feel like
context.
the divine name would be longer. And would
Oh, I don't
it
think
would
so.
be like before Abraham was I am who I am, or I am who will be, or something like that,
No, but
would
there's no
seem to be
yeah.
it's not the full divine name as you see it in the Septuagint, I
I
guess,
think it's a
is the bulk
very
of my
weird.
point.
I think it's a very weird construction,
Well, it's a very
not
weird
invoking
construction.
the divine name. I mean,
It's a weird construction. I will grant fully well that and in fact, I've heard people say it doesn't even make grammatical sense in Greek, no matter how you interpret it. It's like almost intentionally agrammatical.
but it is pretty explicable in those other places. The blind man, we know exactly what he's saying. The context makes it very clear, right? I'm the guy, that you're talking about. Jesus on the water. I am it is I. Don't worry, it's me, as they say,
Right.
the person right? To
The
the woman
Samaritan woman.
woman well, I'm the person you just named. You just named the Messiah. I'm the one. I'm him. I'm he.
And then, but
So
I'd
here,
argue
I
in
don't think it's
this,
nearly as explicable. I
but
really
I
don't.
think in the last sentence, your father Abraham rejoiced they would see my day. He saw it and was glad, right? He that's Jesus's argument for why he's more important than Abraham, right? Like Abraham wouldn't look forward to the day of someone who is beneath him, right? I think is basically the logic of it, right? Because he gets accused, are you more important than our father Abraham? So he's explaining how he's actually more important than Abraham,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's sort of like the idea, surely the lesser is not blessed, or surely the greater is not blessed by the lesser, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's somewhere in there, which is also an argument for subordinationism, but a different time. But like, someone wouldn't look forward to someone who is less than them, I think
Mm-hmm.
is the logic of the argument.
I can see that.
And so I think that Jesus is just identifying himself as the one that Abraham is looking forward to, namely the Messiah.
That's
And
not nearly as clear. I mean, that's just not clear to me at all. Whereas those other places, it's just immediate. It's like we know
well,
exactly what he meant
I
by
mean,
before.
I'm
Before,
just referencing the previous sentence that Jesus said. It's not irrelevant to the context, but I will
before
agree that
Abraham
it's
was, I
less
am he. I am
obvious.
the guy he was looking forward to. I don't know. It just that's there's no real question that's answering. It does not fit the context the same way that those other interpretations fit their context, I would say. Now, is there one other question you
Fair
want to ask
enough.
me? Like, I'm here giving you a hard time, which I
Oh,
did not actually come here intending to
no,
do.
that's fine. I don't mind being given a hard time. All right. Well, so let's see here. I'm looking at my question. So you brought this question up earlier. I guess you can go out on this question. Why do you think, because both you and Dr. Licona, sorry, when I listened to a video of him, explaining why are the Gospels different, he spends most of the time talking about why Jesus is God, right? He doesn't even spend that much time talking about why the Gospels are different. And it's as if that's the one thing he is seeking to preserve. And it seems that also when you are talking about what could be lost, if the reliability and the historical reportage of the Gospels were to be undermined, it seems like one of the things that you're worried about being lost is essentially the deity of Christ.
That's one of them. I
Near
mean,
the
there's a
top
lot
of
of
the
others
list.
too,
There's a
but
lot of others, but that's near the top of the list. And that's why you don't like a minimal facts argument for the resurrection and other things, because, minimal facts loses a lot of the other facts. And this seems to be on the list of facts that you're seeking to preserve. I guess
like teachings of Jesus, right?
teachings of Jesus. So what, to me, the deity of Jesus in the way that you mean it, as opposed to some sort of, exalted human sort of divinity
Mm-hmm.
by the way that I mean it, it doesn't seem like it loses that much, because I've drifted between Unitarian and Trinitarian evangelical churches, and like 99% of the time things are fine. And So what exactly is it that you think is being lost
Mhm.
if we were to perhaps undermine, in your eyes, the reliability of passages like John 8:58 and other deity of Christ passages?
So we definitely want to note that this is a theological question. Of course, we've
Yes,
been discussing a ton of theological questions, not a historical question.
yes,
The interesting thing is that you and I both think John 8:58 is historical. So that's kind of interesting.
yeah,
And recognizably so, which I think Craig Evans questions. I really do think he questions whether Jesus said that in a way you could have recognized, if you'd been there. Um, well, so I'm going to be blunt here. I think y'all are committing idolatry.
fair enough.
So I think what would be lost is a Jesus that we actually should be worshiping. So if Jesus is God, we should be worshiping him in this sense of like committing ourselves completely to him. If he is not God, then I would say we should not be. And there's just no room for middle ground in there. I don't think at all theologically. So theologically what we would lose is a Jesus whom we should be worshiping. And so that the stakes are high. I think this makes the stakes very high in the question. It makes an important question. Then of course it combined with a lot of other questions like the atonement. And I'm not going to go into that, but like, how does the deity of Jesus inform the doctrine of the atonement? How does the deity of Jesus inform our answer to the problem of evil? I think there's an interesting connection there with the problem of evil, particularly the emotional or psychological problem of evil, that God was actually there suffering evil himself. He came down among us. And of course, the doctrine of the incarnation itself is a very great and beautiful doctrine that I do not want to be teaching people if it isn't true. If it's true, I want to be teaching it to people. If it's not true, I don't want to be teaching it to people because that's important. So, because I think the truth is important. So, for all those reasons, this is something we want to get right. And I do think that Jesus is most explicit about it in John. I do not think there's any contradiction with the synoptics, but I think that reasonable people can debate the synoptic ones a little bit more. I was talking to someone just yesterday, and he said, "Well, I think that there's higher Christology in the synoptics than you do," and I said, "Well, I think that there's high Christology in this passage in the synoptics for this reason." He said, "Oh no, I don't think it's for that reason. I think there's high Christology in that passage for this other reason." And I said to him, "See, the very fact that we can debate about this more in the synoptics than in John means that John is a really important part of our data. That if you throw it out, I mean, I certainly would not want to be having this debate with you without John 8:58 as historical, as common ground. If you were here saying, "Oh, I don't even think that happened. I think that's a Johannine gloss or whatever," my argument would be significantly hampered. And I'm not saying I couldn't reference places in the synoptics, but this is a stronger argument, not because there's any contradiction, but just because John happens to have recorded the places where I think Jesus was the most explicit. So I want to have those available.
Hmm. Well, teaching the truth for truth's sake, understanding the truth for truth's sake, that's, I think, a very good note to end on. So thank you
Cool.
very much, Dr. Lydia McGrew. I really appreciate you coming on.